land of the people of the water, along the quiet shores and deep forests of the Pacific Northwest, this is the High Strangeness Sleep Society. Tonight, we drift into the life of one man, a reporter who went looking for strange things and kept a careful record of what he found. Settle in, lower the lights, and let the mystery unfold. Tonight we begin in 1953, Bridgeport, Connecticut, a small apartment above a row of storefronts, a desk pushed against a wall, a typewriter, stacks of letters, carbon copies, envelopes addressed to strangers who had all seen something in the sky. The man at that desk was named Albert K. Bender. Bender was not famous, not yet. He was a young enthusiast of the unexplained, running a small organization devoted to studying flying saucers. He published a newsletter. It reached a few hundred readers, maybe more. In the early 1950s, that was enough. The letters he received were strange, but not impossible. Lights hovering over farmland, metallic objects crossing the night sky without sound, shapes that did not move like aircraft should move. Bender collected them carefully. He organized reports. He wrote summaries. He tried to look serious about it. And then something changed. He began to complain of headaches, not mild ones, pressure behind the eyes, a dull pulse at the base of the skull. He told friends he felt watched, not metaphorically, watched in the room. There was also a smell. He described it as sulfur, like a struck match, sharp, lingering, not constant, but present at odd moments. He checked the wiring. He checked the gas lines. Nothing seemed wrong. One evening, alone in his apartment, he became aware that he was no longer alone. He did not describe hearing the door open. There was no knock, no footsteps on the stairs. He simply sensed that 3 figures were standing in the room. He looked up from his desk. There they were, 3 men dressed in dark suits, hats pulled low, faces pale, expressionless. Bender would later say their eyes reflected light in a way that felt wrong. Not glowing, not supernatural, just reflective, like something slightly artificial. They did not introduce themselves. Instead, according to Bender, communication happened without spoken words. He felt pressure in his head, thoughts that were not his own, instructions. He was told, calmly, that he was to cease his activities, that he had discovered something that was not intended for public circulation. There were no threats, no raised voices, no weapons, just certainty. He said the smell of sulfur intensified while they were present. The air felt heavy, metallic. The figures did not move much. They seemed almost rigid, as if posture were something they were consciously maintaining. The encounter did not last long. Bender could not say exactly how long, minutes perhaps, maybe less, and then they were gone. Not walking out the door, not descending the stairs. Gone. The room felt normal again, except for the smell. That lingered. Within weeks, Bender dissolved his organization. He stopped publishing his newsletter. He withdrew from public discussion. There was no scandal, no formal explanation, just a quiet announcement that the organization was closing. Readers were confused. Some were angry. Others assumed he had lost interest. Bender would later claim that the visitors had shown him information about the true nature of the phenomenon. Information so disturbing that he chose silence. Whether one believes that or not is almost beside the point. What interested later researchers was not the dramatic framing, it was the pattern. Years after Bender's experience, a writer named John Keel began studying cases like this. Keel was not quick to accept spectacular claims. He approached reports like a journalist. He looked for repetition. He looked for structure. And in Bender's account, he noticed something that would appear again and again in later encounters. Men in dark clothing, ill-fitting suits, unnatural posture, odd communication style, and sometimes that smell. Sulfur, ozone, air after lightning. Keel did not treat Bender's story as proof of extraterrestrials. He treated it as a template, because after 1953, similar reports began surfacing. Witnesses who had reported unusual lights or craft would receive visits, not from police, not from obvious government officials, but from men who behaved slightly outside normal social expectations. They would ask questions that felt rehearsed. They would misuse simple language. They would seem unfamiliar with everyday objects. And in some cases, the air would carry that same sharp scent. Brief, difficult to place, easy to dismiss. In Bender's apartment, there had been no violence, no visible technology, no flashing devices, just presence. That may be the most unsettling part. The encounter felt procedural, almost administrative, as if something had noticed that he was noticing. Bender never fully provided a conventional explanation. He never returned to his earlier level of public enthusiasm. He seemed, by many accounts, subdued afterward. It is possible to view his story as stress, as imagination, as embellishment. But it is also possible to notice how often certain details recur across decades. 3 men, dark suits, unnatural stillness, and a smell like a match struck in a closed room. Tonight, we are not here to decide whether Albert Bender met something extraordinary. We are here to examine why so many later reports follow the same structure. Why do these figures appear after sightings? Why do they behave as though they are imitating authority rather than embodying it? And why, in case after case, do witnesses describe them as slightly unfinished? In 1953, in a quiet apartment in Bridgeport, something interrupted a man's curiosity. Whether that interruption came from within his own mind or from something external remains debated. But the pattern did not end with him. It was only beginning. And that is where John Keel enters the story. By the mid-1960s, reports of unusual aerial phenomena were no longer rare. They moved in waves, clusters, flurries of attention followed by silence. Into that landscape stepped John Keel. Keel was not a conventional believer, and he was not a conventional skeptic. He had worked as a journalist. He traveled widely. He had an eye for patterns and a distrust of easy conclusions. When he began investigating UFO sightings, he did not limit himself to the sky. He listened to the witnesses. He visited their homes. He paid attention to what happened before and after the reported event. And it was in the aftermath that he noticed something strange. Witnesses who described lights in the sky sometimes reported follow-up contact, not from newspapers, not from law enforcement, but from individuals who appeared unannounced, asked unusual questions, and then disappeared. Keel read about Albert Bender's experience from more than a decade earlier. He did not treat it as isolated. He placed it alongside newer accounts. He looked for repetition. He found it. Men in black suits, often described as slightly outdated. Jackets cut in a style not quite matching the current year. Ties too narrow or too wide. Shoes polished to a mirror finish. They would identify themselves vaguely, sometimes as investigators, sometimes as representatives of an unspecified authority. Rarely would they produce credentials that could be examined closely. Witnesses often said the men behaved stiffly, they held their bodies too straight. Their movements lacked the casual adjustments most people make without thinking. Keel became interested in the small errors. He once wrote that the phenomenon seemed to contain what he called absurd elements. Not dramatic ones, not cinematic. Absurd in the sense that something was slightly out of place. The men in black would ask about obvious things. What do you eat? How does this device function? Why do you sleep? On paper, those questions are harmless. In context, they felt misplaced. A trained government agent does not need to ask why humans boil water. A federal investigator does not appear confused by a telephone. Keel noticed another detail. The visitors often arrived shortly after a sighting had been reported to others. Not always immediately, sometimes days later, occasionally weeks. The delay mattered. It suggested monitoring rather than reaction. In his book, The Mothman Prophecies, Keel described numerous encounters in and around small towns where strange lights had been seen. He documented how witnesses reported being questioned by men who seemed unfamiliar with ordinary customs. One witness said the visitor attempted to eat gelatin with a fork, staring at it as if it were mechanical. Another described a man who handled coins as though they were delicate instruments rather than loose change. These were not dramatic confrontations. There were no threats shouted across kitchen tables, no physical harm reported. Instead, there was a sense of scrutiny. Keel began to suspect that the men in black were not suppressing information in the conventional sense. If they were government agents, they were unusually incompetent. They left impressions that were memorable rather than forgettable. They behaved as though they were playing a role. This is where Keel diverged from many of his contemporaries. He did not believe the phenomenon could be reduced to visitors from another planet. He felt that explanation was too simple, too mechanical. He proposed something stranger. He suggested that the experiences people reported might not originate from distant galaxies at all. Instead, they might arise from something embedded in the fabric of reality itself. An intelligence that interacts with human perception, adapts to cultural expectations, and manifests in forms that match the era. In medieval times, such entities might have appeared as angels or demons. In the 1950s and 1960s, during the Cold War, they wore suits. Authority in that period was dark fabric, narrow ties, and polished shoes. If an intelligence wished to be taken seriously, that was the costume. Keel referred to this overarching force as a control system, not a government agency, not a single being, more like a regulating presence, something that responded when human curiosity pushed too far in one direction. He observed that UFO waves often coincided with social tension, war fears, technological anxiety, rapid cultural change. And after the sightings, after the excitement, came the correction. A visit, a warning, a conversation that left the witness unsettled but not harmed. Keel did not insist that every report was literal. He acknowledged that perception is fragile, memory is imperfect. But he argued that the repetition of certain elements could not be ignored. The men in black were one of those elements. They did not act like extraterrestrials stepping off a craft. They acted like auditors reviewing a file, calm, detached, slightly confused by the furniture. Keel believed the details mattered more than the spectacle. The way a visitor held a pen, the delay in a smile, the faint odor that lingered in a room. If there was a pattern, it would not announce itself loudly. It would repeat quietly, and that repetition, he felt, was the real mystery. By the time Keel immersed himself in cases around small towns in Appalachia and beyond, he was no longer asking whether UFOs were real in a mechanical sense. He was asking what kind of intelligence behaves this way and why it seems to care when someone begins paying attention. That question would follow him into some of the strangest investigations of his career. When John Keel began organizing his notes, he did not start with spacecraft. He started with behavior. Over time, he accumulated interviews from witnesses across different states: farmers, housewives, teenagers, police officers. The professions varied, the details of the sightings varied. But when the men in black appeared, something in the mannerisms felt consistent. It was not simply the clothing. Yes, the suits were almost always dark, black or deep charcoal, jackets that did not quite drape naturally, fabric described as slightly shiny, as if new or synthetic. But clothing can be purchased. What Keel focused on was movement. Witnesses often described the visitors as stiff, not paralyzed, not robotic, just slightly restrained, as though every gesture required deliberate thought. They stood too straight. They turned their heads without shifting their shoulders. They did not fidget. One woman in the Midwest reported that the man who visited her blinked so infrequently that she found herself counting the seconds between each closure of his eyes. Another said that when the visitor smiled, the smile appeared a fraction of a second after the rest of his face had already formed the expression, as if the emotion were being applied in layers. Keel wrote that the most revealing detail was often speech. The men in black did not threaten loudly. They did not shout or posture. Instead, they spoke in oddly formal constructions. Witnesses reported phrases like, "We are pleased to engage in discourse regarding your observation," or, "You have encountered what is not intended for extended review." The words were correct. The grammar was intact. But the cadence felt rehearsed, slightly detached from natural conversation. Idioms sometimes failed. One man in Ohio recalled saying, "Well, that really blew my mind." The visitor responded by asking calmly whether his head had sustained injury. Literal interpretation, no social cushioning. There were also repeated references to bodily maintenance. How often do you replace your teeth? What is the frequency of your nourishment? Why do you require sleep? To an outside observer, these questions could be curiosity. To the person seated at the kitchen table, they felt misplaced. A government agent does not need to confirm that humans sleep. A law enforcement officer does not inquire about dental replacement schedules. Keel noted that these small mismatches accumulated. In one case, a visitor asked for water and then examined the glass as though unsure of how to approach it. In another, a man attempted to use a ballpoint pen with such force that the tip bent, leaving a dark streak across the paper. It was not incompetence in the ordinary sense. It felt like unfamiliarity, as if the individual understood the outline of human life but not the details. Another recurring detail was the handling of money. Coins would be turned over repeatedly, studied closely, paper currency inspected as though it might contain hidden mechanisms. In several reports, the men in black asked how much an item cost and then seemed confused by the concept of exchange. Keel resisted the urge to explain this as simple eccentricity. He asked a different question. Why would trained officials behave this way consistently across states and years? The visits were rarely aggressive. Most ended quietly. The visitor would stand, offer a vague statement about discretion, and leave. But the departure was often strange. Cars described as large, dark sedans were seen in driveways without anyone noticing their arrival. In some cases, witnesses could not recall hearing an engine start. In others, neighbors reported no vehicle at all. And then there was the matter of time. Several witnesses described a feeling that the conversation lasted longer than the clock suggested. Others felt the opposite. Minutes stretched into something heavier. Keel did not treat these distortions as proof of anything specific. He cataloged them. He noticed that electrical disturbances sometimes followed a visit. Phone lines filled with static. Television screens flickered. Radios emitted bursts of interference. In a few cases, pets reacted strongly. Dogs refusing to enter rooms where a visitor had stood. Cats arching their backs at empty doorways. Animals have been used throughout folklore as barometers of the unseen. Keel did not rely on that symbolism, but he noted the repetition. And then there was the smell, not always present, but present often enough to matter. Witnesses described the air after a visit as sharp, metallic, like a struck match or a brief electrical surge. The same description Albert Bender had offered years earlier. Sulfur is an easy detail to dismiss. Houses contain wiring, basements contain dampness, odors drift. But when the same sensory detail appears in unrelated accounts, Keel felt it deserved attention. What unsettled him most was not that these visitors appeared, it was that they seemed to learn. Early reports described men who struggled more visibly with social norms. Later accounts suggested smoother interaction, though still imperfect. If these were impersonators, they were adjusting. If they were part of a larger phenomenon, that phenomenon was refining its presentation. Keel once suggested that the absurd elements were not mistakes, they were clues. An intelligence attempting to mimic authority might not fully grasp the texture of everyday life. It might know that officials wear dark suits. It might know that humans shake hands, but it might not instinctively understand why someone says, "Make yourself at home." To which one witness reported the visitor responded by standing in the center of the living room, rigid, as if awaiting further instruction. The effect of these encounters was rarely immediate terror. It was discomfort, a lingering sense that something had been slightly off, that a performance had been staged for an audience of one. Keel believed that if the men in black were purely human agents, they would aim to blend in, to disappear into memory. Instead, they left impressions that stayed vivid for years. The stiffness, the delayed smile, the confusion over a pen, the question about teeth. It was not what they said. It was how they said it. And in those small slips, Keel believed the real mystery revealed itself. By the time John Keel had gathered enough interviews to fill boxes, he found himself moving away from the simple question of what the men in black were. He began asking what function they served. If they were government agents, they were unusually theatrical. If they were extraterrestrials, they were oddly preoccupied with minor details of domestic life. Keel proposed something more abstract. He suggested that the phenomenon surrounding UFO sightings, strange entities, prophetic dreams, and the men in black might not be separate categories at all. They might be expressions of a single underlying system. He called it at times a control system. The phrase sounds mechanical, cold, but Keel did not mean machinery in the ordinary sense. He meant a regulating presence, something that monitors and adjusts the flow of human belief. In this view, the phenomenon adapts to the era. In centuries past, unusual lights in the sky might have been interpreted as angels or omens. Entities that appeared in bedrooms might have been described as demons or spirits. The clothing would match the time, the language would match the culture. In the 1950s and 1960s, authority wore dark suits. Authority knocked on doors and asked questions. Authority carried clipboards. If an intelligence wished to shape perception, It would choose a form that resonated with the expectations of the period. Keel noticed that waves of UFO sightings often followed periods of social tension, the Cold War, technological anxiety, cultural shifts. Public fascination would surge, newspapers would print stories, radio programs would amplify reports. Then, in some cases, came the visits. The men in black did not always silence witnesses directly. Instead, they introduced uncertainty. They asked odd questions. They created discomfort. They blurred the boundary between official investigation and something else entirely. If a witness felt confused rather than validated, the story might weaken. The edges would soften. Keel wondered whether the phenomenon corrected belief the way a thermostat regulates temperature. Too much certainty in one direction might trigger a balancing response. He observed that when UFO enthusiasm grew intense, encounters often became stranger rather than clearer. Sightings would be accompanied by bizarre details. Mechanical craft would be joined by glowing figures. Hard data would dissolve into dreamlike elements. The men in black fit this pattern. They looked official, but they behaved in ways that undermined the simplicity of that explanation. If they were meant to suppress, they did so inefficiently. They left witnesses with stories that were more unsettling than reassuring. Keel wrote that the phenomenon often contained absurdities. That absurdity might not be accidental. It might be a signal that human interpretation is being nudged off balance. In the control system model, reality is not static, it responds. When a person reports seeing a structured craft in the sky, the experience might not end with the sighting. The system might follow up. It might introduce ambiguity. A visit, a warning, a question that makes no sense. Keel was careful not to claim certainty. He did not draw diagrams. He did not assign headquarters to the phenomenon. He simply noted that reports across decades contained recurring elements that could not be explained away by conventional categories alone. He also pointed out that the phenomenon seemed aware of being observed. Witnesses reported that after speaking publicly, they experienced phone interference, silent calls, static bursts on the line, radios flickering briefly. These disturbances were minor, easy to dismiss, but they clustered around attention. Keel proposed that attention itself might be a trigger. If human belief creates momentum, perhaps the system reacts to maintain equilibrium. The men in black, in this interpretation, are not enforcers of secrecy in a governmental sense. They are punctuation marks. When a story begins to harden into certainty, they introduce a question mark. Their odd behavior may be part of that function. If they appeared as flawless officials with perfect credentials, witnesses might conclude they had been formally warned by authorities. The narrative would settle. Instead, the visitor mishandles a pen, misunderstands an idiom, asks about teeth. The encounter destabilizes the witness rather than clarifying anything. Keel sometimes compared the phenomenon to folklore. Fairy lore contains similar patterns: mysterious visitors who appear at thresholds, questions about food, warnings not to speak of certain experiences. In older traditions, entities were said to wear disguises that were almost convincing, but not entirely. A detail would betray them: a cloven hoof, a reflection missing from a mirror. In modern America, the cloven hoof might be a narrow tie worn years out of fashion. Keel did not argue that the men in black were literal demons. He argued that the structure of encounters mirrored ancient stories. The forms changed, the function remained. If the control system exists, it does not need to be malevolent. It may simply regulate. In a complex system, feedback loops maintain stability. If human belief begins to drift too far into one fixed explanation, an opposing influence may arise. This model allows for sincerity on the part of witnesses. It does not require them to be delusional. It suggests that experiences may be both externally triggered and internally shaped. A sighting occurs. A visit follows. The visit contains elements that do not fully align with expectation. The witness is left uncertain. Uncertainty dampens conviction. Conviction settles into folklore rather than fact. Keel recognized that this hypothesis raises as many questions as it answers. What is being regulated? Who or what designs the system? Is it conscious in a way humans would recognize? He offered no definitive map, but he returned repeatedly to the observation that the men in black seemed less interested in suppressing evidence than in managing interpretation. They asked witnesses what they saw. They asked who else had been told. They did not always demand silence. Sometimes they simply suggested caution, or implied that the experience might not be beneficial to pursue. In that sense, they behaved less like secret police and more like administrators. Quiet, formal, slightly out of step with the environment. If the control system hypothesis holds any truth, then reality may not be a stage set once and left alone. It may be dynamic, and when someone peers too closely at a seam in the scenery, something arrives to smooth it. Not violently, not dramatically, just enough to keep the play moving. Perhaps the men in black are not here to hide the truth. Perhaps they are here to maintain it. And if maintenance requires a visitor at the kitchen table asking about a pen, then that is the form it will take. For Keel, the important question was never whether the visitors came from another planet. It was whether the pattern itself suggested an intelligence woven into the fabric of events, an intelligence that watches and occasionally responds. In late 1966, in and around Point Pleasant, strange reports began to cluster. Lights over fields, large shapes moving low across the tree line, something described by some as winged, by others as mechanical, by others still as simply wrong. John Keel spent long stretches of time in that town. He drove the back roads. He sat in living rooms. He listened. Not every encounter involved something in the sky. Some involved a knock, or rather, the absence of one. One couple living outside town along a narrow stretch of rural road reported seeing an unusual light hovering above a distant patch of farmland. It was not dramatic. It did not land. It did not beam anyone aboard. It hovered, then it vanished. They told a neighbor. The neighbor told someone at the hardware store. Within days, the story had traveled. The visit did not happen the next night. It happened several evenings later. There was no car engine heard in the driveway, no crunch of gravel. There was simply a man standing at the front door when the husband glanced through the window. He wore a black suit. The fabric caught the porch light in a faint sheen. His tie was narrow, slightly outdated for the season. His shoes were polished to a shine that seemed excessive for rural mud roads. He kept his hat on when the door opened. He introduced himself as being associated with investigative authority. He did not specify which. His voice was steady, flat, calm. He asked about the light. How long had it been observed? What direction had it traveled? Who had been told? The questions were brief, almost procedural. Then his attention shifted. On the kitchen table lay a simple ballpoint pen. He stared at it. He asked, "What is the fuel source for this instrument?" The husband laughed softly and said it was ink. The visitor nodded once, slowly. He picked up the pen, turned it over in his fingers, pressed the tip hard against a scrap of paper. The line that appeared was thick and uneven. He pressed harder. The pen cracked. Ink spilled across his hand. He looked at the stain with visible confusion. Not irritation, not anger, confusion. The wife later said that his expression seemed delayed, as if the idea of ink staining skin required processing time. He set the pen down carefully. He then asked in the same steady tone how often they replaced their teeth. The husband assumed he had misheard. The visitor repeated the question. The wife answered that they did not replace their teeth, not routinely. He nodded again, slowly. When offered coffee, he accepted the cup but did not drink from it. He held it, examined the surface, set it back down, untouched. At one point, the husband said, "Well, make yourself at home." The visitor moved to the center of the kitchen and stood there, rigid, hands at his sides, waiting. It was not threatening. It was off. After several minutes, he stood abruptly. He said, "You have observed what is not intended for extended attention." The phrasing was precise, slightly unnatural. He thanked them for their hospitality. The wording sounded memorized. He turned and left. The husband stepped outside moments later. There was no car in the driveway, no taillights disappearing down the road. Nothing. That night, while washing dishes, the wife noticed a smell, faint at first, then sharper. Not gas, not smoke. Something like a struck match, or the air after a brief electrical surge. The husband dismissed it. Old wiring, perhaps. But the odor lingered into the next day. Their dog refused to enter the kitchen. It stood at the threshold, whining softly. Within a week, their phone began producing bursts of static during calls. The television screen flickered once or twice without cause. Small disturbances, easy to rationalize. But when John Keel heard the account, he did not focus on the light over the field. He focused on the pen, on the teeth, on the phrase, "fuel source for this instrument," and on the smell. Because 13 years earlier, in a small apartment in Connecticut, Albert Bender had described something similar. A sharp scent, sulfur, air like a match struck in a closed room. Keel did not declare the two events identical. He did not insist they shared an origin. He simply noted the repetition. Men in dark suits, questions that revealed slight misunderstandings, attention to mundane objects, a faint metallic odor, electrical interference afterward, and always the sense that the visit occurred because someone had noticed something. The Point Pleasant couple were not harmed. They were not threatened, but they did not report further sightings. They did not speak as freely afterward. It was not fear that settled in, and it was hesitation. Keel wrote that hesitation was often the result. The men in black did not erase memories. They introduced doubt. They made the experience feel unstable, as though reality itself had briefly misaligned. In that small kitchen, with ink spreading across a hand that did not seem to expect it, something played out that mirrored accounts from years before. Not a dramatic confrontation, a correction, quiet, administrative, and accompanied once again by the faint scent of something burned, or perhaps something discharged. Keel would later suggest that when patterns repeat across time and geography, the details matter more than the spectacle, and in both Bridgeport and Point Pleasant, it was not the sky that carried the strongest echo. It was the air in the room, and the feeling that someone had come to observe the observers. It is a quiet thing, this pattern. No explosions, no official press conferences, no photographs laid neatly on a desk under fluorescent light. Just living rooms, kitchen tables, a pen pressed too hard against paper, and the faint scent of something like a match struck in a room that had no reason to burn. If you have been listening closely tonight, you may have noticed something. The men in black are not described as monsters. Not really. They are described as slightly misaligned, as if they learned the outline of being human from a manual, a thin one. They know the uniform of authority. They know how to ask questions. They know to say thank you. But they do not always know when to blink, or how to respond to humor, or what ink feels like when it stains skin. John Keel never insisted that these visitors were extraterrestrials. He did not describe spacecraft parked behind hedges or secret bases beneath mountains. He described patterns. He described repetition. He described a phenomenon that seemed aware of being noticed. That may be the part that lingers. If something responds when attention intensifies, then the act of observation becomes part of the event. A sighting happens, a story spreads, a visitor arrives. A question is asked that does not quite make sense, and the witness begins to doubt not only what was seen, but what was understood. Keel's control system hypothesis does not require villains. It does not require conspiracies in underground chambers. It requires only that reality may be more dynamic than we assume. That belief may have weight. That attention may create pressure. In such a system, balance would need to be maintained. Too much certainty in one direction could distort the whole. And so perhaps the men in black function less like enforcers and more like regulators. They do not destroy evidence. They do not confiscate memories. They introduce friction, a small error in the conversation, a phrase slightly out of place, a scent that does not belong, just enough to prevent the experience from settling into something solid. It is easy to laugh at these details. A man confused by a pen, a question about teeth. But if dozens of unrelated witnesses describe similar slips across years and miles, the laughter softens. The pattern becomes harder to ignore. There is something deeply unsettling about the idea that the world may correct itself when examined too closely. That when someone peers at a seam in the scenery, something steps forward to smooth the fabric. Not angrily, not violently, just methodically. In both Bridgeport and Point Pleasant, the visitors did not rage, they did not threaten, they observed, they asked, they left. And afterward, the witnesses felt something difficult to articulate. Not terror, adjustment, as if the air had shifted slightly, as if a door had opened and closed without sound. If the control system exists, it may not be concerned with truth in the way we understand it. It may be concerned with equilibrium, and equilibrium requires correction. You may never see a light over a field. You may never answer the door to a man in a dark suit who asks about your teeth. Most people do not. But the next time you notice something that does not quite fit, a pattern that seems too consistent, a coincidence that lingers longer than it should, pause for a moment. Consider the possibility that noticing itself is part of the equation. John Keel once suggested that the phenomenon was less about visitors from distant worlds and more about something woven through this one, something that adapts, something that reflects our era back to us. In the Middle Ages, it wore robes. In the Cold War, it wore black suits. Today, perhaps it wears something else. The forms change, the function may not. And if that is true, then the men in black are not relics of a strange decade. They are recurring characters in a story that has not finished unfolding. Out there, beyond the reach of porch lights and radio towers, the night continues as it always has. Quiet, vast, patient. If you ever find yourself at the center of something unusual, and days later there is a knock that may not be a knock, remember this. The question may not be who they are. It may be why they arrived. If you are still awake, thank you for keeping the night company. We will continue next time. Until then, keep your lights low And perhaps, just for tonight, try not to look too closely at the seams. From the land of the people of the water, along the quiet shores and deep forests of the Pacific Northwest, where the rivers keep their secrets and the mountains stand guard in the dark, this is the High Strangeness Sleep Society. A place for sleepless minds, late-night wanderers, and those of us who have always suspected the world is just a little stranger than it pretends to be. Tonight we leave the rain-soaked cedar and salt air behind and travel east to the hills of West Virginia, where the Ohio River moves slow and black beneath old bridges, and where the highways cut through the mountains like long ribbons of silence. It is a landscape made for stories. Coal towns, river fog, old diners still glowing past midnight, and roads that feel far lonelier after dark than they ever do in daylight. If you have ever driven alone at night through country like that, you know the feeling. The radio low, the windshield full of rain, the sense that the world beyond your headlights might be holding its breath. In the autumn of 1966, before Point Pleasant became forever linked to wings and red eyes, and before the word Mothman entered American folklore, another story was already unfolding just up the road near Parkersburg. It did not begin with a creature in the woods or strange lights over the river. It began with a man trying to get home. His name was Woodrow Derenberger, and by every reasonable measure he was ordinary, which is often how these stories begin. He was a husband, a father, and a traveling salesman, a man whose days were shaped by miles of highway, paper cups of coffee, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing the porch light on when he finally pulled into the driveway. He was not a professional mystic. He was not writing letters to flying saucer clubs. He was not standing in open fields waiting for visitors from the stars. He was working, driving, paying bills, and doing what most people do, which is trying to make it through the week with as little trouble as possible. That is part of what made people listen when he told his story. He did not sound like a man searching for attention. If anything, he sounded like someone who would have preferred the entire thing had never happened. It was the evening of November 2nd, 1966. He was driving south on Interstate 77 near the Route 47 interchange, heading home through rain and darkness. The road was slick, the kind of wet pavement that turns every headlight into a reflection and every mile into two. The hills around him were black against a darker sky, and traffic had thinned to almost nothing. Just the steady sweep of the wipers, the hum of the engine, and that familiar late-night highway trance where your hands know the road better than your thoughts do. And then beside him, something appeared. At first he thought it was another vehicle pacing his truck, but almost immediately he understood that whatever had pulled alongside him was not moving like any ordinary car. He would later describe it as dark and charcoal gray, shaped like the glass chimney of an old kerosene lamp, low and solid, with a smoothness that felt wrong somehow, as though it had been built without the same logic the rest of our machines obey. It hovered just above the road and matched his speed with impossible ease, holding position beside him like it had been there all along. Then it turned, slowly and deliberately, and settled across both lanes of the interstate, blocking the road from berm to berm. He brought the truck to a stop. Now, if you are listening to this late at night, safe at home with the lights low, it is easy to imagine what you would do. You would turn around, you would reverse, you would decide very quickly that whatever was happening ahead of you was not your business. But fear and curiosity have always been close cousins, and sometimes the need to understand is stronger than the instinct to run. A door opened, and what stepped out was not a monster. That may be the strangest part of the whole story. No silver suit, no bug-eyed visitor from a drive-in movie, no glowing being from another dimension, just a man, about 6 feet tall, dark hair combed straight back, a deep tan, as though he had spent his life beneath a stronger sun than West Virginia had ever offered. He wore dark blue clothing with a faint shine to it, almost formal but impossible to place, and he stood there with his arms folded beneath his chest, like a patient man waiting for someone to finish asking the obvious question. And he was smiling. Not a warm smile, not a friendly smile, a fixed smile, calm, steady, the kind of smile that somehow makes a quiet room feel much quieter. Derenberger would later say the fear truly arrived when he realized the man's lips were not moving. The voice came anyway, not through the air but directly into his mind. Calm, clear, almost polite. Do not be frightened. We wish you no harm. Imagine that for a moment. A silent highway, rain ticking softly against the truck, a stranger standing in the headlights, smiling, and a voice arriving inside your own thoughts like it had always been there. The questions he asked were strangely ordinary. What were the lights in the distance? What was the name of that city? What kind of work did he do? There was something deeply unsettling about how normal the conversation sounded. It was as if someone had studied human beings from a distance and learned the structure of small talk without ever understanding why we bothered with it. Derenberger answered. Those were the lights of Parkersburg, he explained. He told him he was a salesman. The stranger listened, smiling the entire time as though this information mattered. He told Derenberger that they were the same as us. He said he was what he called a searcher. And when Derenberger asked where he came from, the answer was not a planet, not at first. He described it only as a gathering, a strange word, close enough to make sense and wrong enough to stay with you afterward. A gathering of what? A place, a people, a destination. Even now, it feels like the kind of answer that explains nothing and somehow says everything. Then, before stepping back into the dark machine waiting silently across the road, he gave Derenberger one final sentence. Mr. Derenberger, we will see you again. And that, listeners, is where the real story begins. Because he did return. Or at least, Derenberger would spend the rest of his life insisting that he did. The smiling man would come back again and again, and with every new encounter the story would drift farther from the wet pavement of Interstate 77 and deeper into territory where journalism starts to fail and mythology takes over. Soon the man called only Cold would become Indrid Cold. Soon there would be a wife named Kimi, children, a navigator named Carl Ardo, and a home world called Lanulos, a place with 3 seasons, no war, no hatred, and lives that stretched far longer than our own. Somewhere between that first lonely roadside meeting and the impossible geography of Lanulos, the story stopped being a UFO encounter and became something older in shape, a visitation story, a contact myth, a modern American fairy tale told in the language of highways, television stations, and late-night phone calls. And like all stories that survive this long, the real mystery may not be whether it happened. The real mystery may be why we still want it to. Before Lanulos had a name, before Indrid Cold became a permanent resident of paranormal folklore, before John Keel folded the story into the wider storm of Mothman, Men in Black, and ultra-terrestrials. There was simply Woodrow Derenberger trying to explain to people what had happened to him on a wet stretch of highway outside Parkersburg. And that may be the most important part of the story, because strange stories survive or die based on the person telling them. If the witness feels dishonest, the mystery collapses. If the witness feels too polished, too eager, too dramatic, people lean back. But if the witness sounds like someone you know, someone who seems almost uncomfortable speaking at all, the story lingers. It settles in. It becomes harder to dismiss. That was part of Derenberger's strange credibility. He was around 50 years old in the fall of 1966, a salesman from the Parkersburg area, married, with children, living the kind of life that rarely ends up in books about the unexplained. His work meant long drives and longer days. He sold sewing machines and home products, traveling the roads between small towns, knocking on doors, talking to strangers, and doing the ordinary labor of making a living in mid-century America. It was not glamorous, but it was familiar. It gave his life a dependable rhythm. Drive, work, come home, repeat. There is something important in that rhythm because people like routine. We trust it. A man who spends his life following roads and schedules does not easily become the center of something impossible. He is not supposed to. Parkersburg itself was built on that same kind of practical certainty. It was a river town, an industrial place where the Ohio moved steadily past bridges and factories and neighborhoods built around shift work and church schedules. It was a place where people knew their neighbors, where local news mattered, and where stories traveled fast because there were not that many places for them to go. This was not New York. It was not Los Angeles. There were no bright city distractions here, no endless noise to swallow a strange report whole. If something unusual happened, people talked about it. They talked about it at the gas station, at church, over coffee at the diner, and on front porches after dark. Especially if the person telling the story was someone they already knew. That is another reason the case spread so quickly. Derenberger was not a stranger to the community. He was local. He had a family. He had responsibilities. He was not introducing himself through the mystery. People already knew who he was before the mystery arrived. And yet, after that night on Interstate 77, his ordinary life began to bend around one extraordinary event. He did something that still surprises people looking back at the case. He reported it almost immediately. He did not hide it for years. He did not wait until the details became polished. He told people, fast. Within a day, the story had reached local authorities, reporters, and television. He appeared on WTAP in Parkersburg and described the encounter publicly, knowing full well how it would sound. Police were involved. Air Force representatives took interest. Reporters asked the same question in different forms. Are you sure? And every time he gave essentially the same answer. Yes. That consistency matters, even if it does not prove anything. People often assume belief depends on evidence alone, but it rarely works that way. It depends on confidence, on tone, on whether the witness seems to be remembering or performing. Derenberger, at least in those earliest interviews, sounded like a man trying to remember. Not a prophet, not a showman. A man trying to explain why his drive home had stopped making sense. There were supportive voices, too. Some locals believed him. Some said they had seen strange things near the highway that week. One witness later claimed to have seen a figure standing beside a stopped vehicle around the same time. Newspapers began carrying the story farther than Parkersburg. Curiosity seekers arrived. Suddenly, his farm and his family were part of something public. And that is where these stories often become dangerous. Because once the world decides you are the man who saw something impossible, you no longer get to return to being ordinary. Every question becomes about the event. Every silence becomes suspicious. Every contradiction becomes evidence. People want more. They always want more. They do not want a strange encounter. They want answers. Where did the man come from? Why you? Why now? Was it God, aliens, government, madness, prophecy? An ordinary witness quickly discovers that people are not satisfied with uncertainty. They want shape. They want meaning. They want the mystery to point somewhere. And sometimes, perhaps without meaning to, the witness begins giving them one. This is where the story starts to change. Not all at once, not dramatically, just enough to notice. The smiling man was no longer simply a stranger on the road. He had a name now, or at least more of one. Cold. Soon, Indrid Cold. The place he came from was no longer just a gathering. It would become something far more specific. A world. Lanulos. And once a mystery has a proper noun, once it has names and places and details that can be repeated, it becomes much harder to contain. Stories grow faster when people can point to them. This was no longer just a frightening encounter on a rainy highway. It was becoming a map. And maps invite travelers. The press wanted more. Researchers wanted more. Believers wanted more. Skeptics wanted contradictions. And standing in the middle of all of it was a salesman from West Virginia who had started with one strange night and was now being asked to explain an entire universe. That is a heavy thing to place on an ordinary man, maybe too heavy, because 2 days after the first encounter, according to Derenberger, the smiling man returned. And this time he did not just ask questions. This time he told him where he came from. The first encounter on Interstate 77 was strange enough to stand on its own. A dark object hovering over the road, a smiling man with unmoving lips, a voice arriving inside the mind instead of through the air. For most people, that would have been the entire story, a single impossible memory carried for the rest of a life. But according to Woodrow Derenberger, it did not end there. The man he had met on the highway returned, not with flashing lights or another roadside confrontation, but in a way that made the whole thing somehow more unsettling. The second contact did not happen with a crowd watching or police taking notes. It happened quietly while Derenberger was driving again, as though whatever had found him on that first night had simply decided the conversation was not finished. This is the point where the story begins to leave the solid ground of witness testimony and step into stranger country. It is also the point where listeners tend to divide. Some stay with him, others step away, because once the second contact begins, we are no longer talking about a close encounter. We are talking about a relationship. In later retellings, Derenberger said that while driving with a friend named Philip Elliott, he became aware that the object was above them again, moving overhead, unseen but somehow understood. The communication returned the same way it had before, directly into his thoughts, calm and certain, without sound. He was told not to be afraid. He was told to drive carefully. And then, for the first time, the smiling man began to explain himself. His name, he said, was not simply Cold. It was Indrid Cold, and where he came from was called Lanulos. Now, names matter in stories like this. A nameless visitor can remain a mystery forever, but once something has a name, the human mind begins building rooms around it. A name creates shape. It creates memory. It creates the possibility that this thing, whatever it is, belongs somewhere. Lanulos was not described as a distant star in the way science fiction usually imagines. Derenberger would later place it near what he called the galaxy of Ganymede, a phrase that made astronomers wince and believers lean closer. It was not technically correct, but high strangeness rarely is. It sounded like someone translating something too large into the nearest available language and getting the edges wrong. Lanulos, according to Derenberger, was a place of peace. There was no hatred there, no war, no violence in the ordinary human sense. Its people lived far longer than we do, somewhere between 125 and 175 Earth years, depending on which version of the story you read. They experienced 3 seasons instead of 4. Their lives moved differently. Their priorities were different. They had advanced beyond the things that seemed to keep humanity trapped in repetition. For a man living in Cold War America, that description carried its own kind of gravity. Remember the year, 1966, Vietnam on the evening news. Nuclear fear sitting quietly in the background of daily life. Political unrest growing louder. The idea of another world without hatred, without war, without the machinery of human conflict, did not just sound strange, it sounded desirable. That is one reason contactee stories from this era often sound less like invasion stories and more like moral lessons. The visitors are not conquerors, they are mirrors. They arrive not to destroy us, but to quietly suggest that we are living badly. Indrid Cold fit that pattern perfectly. He was not threatening. He was calm, friendly even. He did not arrive with warnings of doom or demands for obedience. He asked questions. He observed. He behaved less like a conqueror than a traveler mildly surprised by the way Earth had organized itself. Derenberger said Cold explained that he was what he called a searcher, someone whose purpose involved movement, observation, and contact. He referred to Earth almost like a neighboring place, familiar but unfinished. There was no grand speech, no declaration of cosmic truth, just the slow unfolding of a world that sounded almost close enough to touch. Soon there were more details. Cold had a wife. Her name was Kimi. He had children. There were others like him, among them a navigator named Carl Ardo, who would become part of the growing mythology surrounding Lanulos. The world itself developed structure. It had systems of leadership, social order, and spiritual ideas that sounded both alien and strangely idealized. The details multiplied, and with every new addition, the story moved farther from the original roadside encounter and deeper into the territory of classic contactee literature. This is where skepticism naturally enters the room, because there is a visible difference between a man describing a strange event and a man describing an entire civilization. One feels like testimony, the other feels like cosmology. And yet Derenberger kept telling it. That is the part people often underestimate. It is easy to dismiss one strange interview. It is harder to explain a person who continues, year after year, to live inside the story they started. Fame from this kind of thing is rarely glamorous. It is expensive. It costs privacy. It costs credibility. It turns ordinary errands into conversations you do not want to have. And still, he stayed with it. He wrote, he gave interviews. He described Lanulos not like fiction, but like memory. Maybe he believed every word. Maybe the story had grown large enough that belief no longer mattered. Because once people begin treating your experience like mythology, even you may stop knowing where the first truth ended. And there is another reason this part of the story matters, because Lanulos was not just a destination, it was a promise. A place where human problems had already been solved. A world where fear, hatred, and violence had been left behind. A place better than here. Every era creates its own version of paradise. Sometimes it is heaven, Sometimes it is Atlantis. Sometimes it is Shangri-La hidden in the mountains. And in 1966, on a dark highway in West Virginia, Paradise arrived wearing a blue coat and a fixed smile. Its name was Lanulos. And according to Woodrow Derenberger, he was not just invited to learn about it, he was invited to visit. Once Lanulos had a name, the story changed shape. A strange encounter on a highway can remain local. It can live in the newspaper for a few days, travel through a few conversations at the diner, and eventually settle into that uncertain category of things people half remember and half doubt. But a named world is different. A named world invites questions. People want to know what it looks like, who lives there, how they live, and perhaps most importantly, whether it might somehow be better than here. And according to Woodrow Derenberger, it was. Lanulos was not described as a harsh alien landscape or some metallic science fiction empire of cold machines and perfect geometry. It sounded in many ways almost domestic, peaceful, ordered, familiar in the way dreams are familiar, where everything makes emotional sense even if the details refuse to stay still. There were seasons there, though not ours. Derenberger spoke of 3 seasons instead of 4, a small detail that somehow made the place feel more believable than grand declarations ever could. Small details are persuasive. They feel accidental. A liar invents drama. A believer remembers weather. Its people lived longer than we do, sometimes far longer, with lifespans stretching well beyond a century. Age was not treated the same way. Time itself seemed softer there, less urgent. There was no sense of the hurried human panic that drives so much of life on Earth, that constant race between work, money, illness, and the quiet knowledge that the clock is always moving. Most striking of all, there was no hatred. No war, no violence in the way we understand it. Now, if that sounds less like an alien report and more like a Sunday sermon, you are not wrong. This is where the Lanulos story begins to resemble something older than ufology. It starts to feel like the old human habit of placing perfection somewhere far away. Another island, another kingdom, another world where the mistakes we keep repeating have already been solved by someone wiser. That is not necessarily evidence of deception. It may be evidence of longing. Because paradise stories rarely tell us where heaven is. They tell us what we wish Earth could be. Indrid Cold, for all his strangeness, was never presented as a conqueror or a prophet of doom. He was not here to warn humanity about invasion fleets or apocalyptic judgment. He was calm, almost gentle, and his presence carried the strange confidence of someone visiting a place he did not fear. He behaved less like an alien and more like a traveler who found us interesting. He also, according to Derenberger, had a family. This detail pushes the story into even stranger territory, because it removes the distance people often place between themselves and the other. It is easy to imagine a mysterious visitor as a symbol, harder to imagine him going home to dinner. Cold had a wife. Her name was Kimmy. He had children. There were routines, relationships, and domestic structures that made Lanulos feel less like a distant cosmic abstraction and more like a place where people simply lived. That intimacy is one reason the story remains so compelling. Monsters are easier to dismiss. Family is harder. Family makes the impossible feel personal. There were others too. One of the most repeated names was Carl Ardo, described as a navigator and associate of Cold, another visitor tied to the same world. Over time, more names entered the mythology, each one making Lanulos feel less like a metaphor and more like a place with its own society, its own cast of characters, its own political and spiritual architecture. Derenberger would describe forms of leadership there, systems of guidance and order, even a kind of governing council. Religion existed, though not in the way most Earth religions framed it. The descriptions shifted depending on the telling, but the consistent theme was harmony, less hierarchy, less conflict, more understanding. Lanulos was not simply advanced in technology, it was morally advanced. And that may be the most suspicious detail of all, because the moment another civilization sounds exactly like our own fantasies of perfection, skepticism naturally sharpens. This is one reason many researchers place the Derenberger story firmly within the tradition of the American contactee movement, a strange little chapter of post-war paranormal history where ordinary people claimed repeated contact with visitors from worlds that often sounded suspiciously like spiritual self-help seminars in space. In the 1950s and 60s, men like George Adamski and others told stories of beautiful, peaceful beings from Venus or beyond who arrived not to invade but to teach. Their messages were often moral. Stop fighting, stop destroying the planet, grow spiritually, become better. Lanulos fits that shape almost perfectly. That does not automatically make it false. It simply places it inside a recognizable pattern. And patterns matter, because once a story enters a pattern, it becomes harder to tell whether the witness is reporting experience or unconsciously borrowing structure from the stories already circulating around them. Sometimes belief works like architecture. We do not invent from nothing. We build using shapes we already know. Maybe Derenberger met something truly strange and spent years trying to explain it using the only language available to him. Or maybe Lanulos was built the way all mythic places are built, one detail at a time, using desire, fear, and the cultural furniture already sitting in the room. Either way, the place became real enough to survive. People still talk about Lanulos today not because they can prove it exists, but because it feels like it should exist. It satisfies a very old hunger. Somewhere out there, the story says, there is a place where people learned how to stop ruining everything. That is a powerful idea, especially in a century built on war, especially in a country watching violence on the evening news every night, especially for an ordinary salesman driving home through rain, being told by a smiling stranger that another way of living was not only possible, but already real. And according to Derenberger, Lanulos was not just a place he heard about. It was a place he would eventually see for himself, which is where the story takes its boldest step. Because hearing about paradise is one thing, claiming you have been there is another entirely. There is a quiet line in stories like this, a point where even the most patient listener has to decide how far they are willing to follow. Seeing a strange object on a dark road is one thing. Meeting a smiling man who speaks without moving his lips is another. Even that, strange as it sounds, can still live in the category of unexplained experience, filed somewhere between fear and possibility. But eventually, the question changes. Did he really go there? That is where the Lanulos story asks the most of us. Because according to Woodrow Derenberger, the smiling man did not remain a visitor at the edge of his life. Indrid Cold became a recurring presence. The encounters continued, conversations deepened. The distance between Earth and Lanulos, whatever that distance truly meant, began to feel less like astronomy and more like an open door. There were visits. Sometimes, Derenberger said, Cold would appear near his home. Not in grand cinematic arrivals, but in the ordinary spaces where strange things become hardest to explain. A backyard, a quiet road, a place near the house where neighbors might have passed without noticing anything unusual at all. That detail matters because it shifts the story from spectacle to intimacy. The extraordinary was no longer interrupting life. It was moving into it. Imagine trying to explain that to your family. Not just that you saw something once, but that it keeps coming back. That there is a man from somewhere beyond language standing near your yard, asking calm questions about your world. That he smiles like he already knows how the conversation ends. These are the kinds of details that make witnesses either saints or liars in the public imagination. There is rarely room for anything in between. And still, Derenberger kept talking. He described repeated contact, long conversations, more details about Lanulos, more names, more certainty. At times, the story took on the structure of correspondence, as though Earth and somewhere else had established a strange and deeply personal diplomatic relationship through one very ordinary man in West Virginia. Then came the biggest claim of all. He said he had gone there. Accounts vary depending on which source you read, and like many stories that grow over years, the exact details shift at the edges. But the central claim remained the same. Derenberger was not merely told about Lanulos. He was taken there, transported, brought to another world. Now, from a purely skeptical point of view, this is the moment many people close the book. A roadside encounter may feel possible. A trip to another planet pushes the story into territory most listeners instinctively reject. And yet, strangely, this is often where belief becomes strongest for the people inside the story. Because once a witness crosses that line publicly, there is no easy return. You are no longer protecting your credibility, you are sacrificing it. That sacrifice creates its own strange kind of conviction. What would Lanulos have looked like? Descriptions differ, but the emotional texture remains consistent. Peace, order, calm, a world without the frantic noise of human conflict. It was not described like a futuristic empire of chrome towers and glowing machines. It felt quieter than that, softer, less interested in technology as spectacle and more interested in civilization as harmony. That may be why the story never feels fully like science fiction. It feels like longing. Lanulos was not impressive because it was advanced. It was impressive because it was better. No hatred, no war, longer lives, greater understanding, a place where the mistakes of Earth had already been left behind. It is difficult not to notice how perfectly this mirrors human fantasy. Every age invents its unreachable country. Medieval Europe had Avalon. Explorers chased El Dorado. Mystics looked for Shambhala. And in post-war America, with rockets rising and nuclear fear hanging over dinner tables, paradise arrived as a neighboring civilization in the stars. Or perhaps beside them, if John Keel was right. But before Keel enters the story, Derenberger had become something else entirely. He was no longer simply a witness. He was a contactee. That word carries a very specific history in American paranormal culture. A witness sees something. A contactee is chosen. They become a bridge between worlds, willingly or not, and their lives are reshaped by that role. People write to them, researchers call, skeptics circle, believers project meaning onto every sentence they speak. And fame, even strange fame, has gravity. Reporters came. Curious strangers arrived. People wanted stories, details, proof. His home became part of the legend. The ordinary privacy of family life gave way to the constant pressure of being the man who knew where Lanulos was. There is something tragic in that, because no matter what you believe about the truth of his claims, it is clear that Derenberger could never fully go back to being anonymous. Once the world decides your name belongs to a mystery, it keeps asking you to feed it. And stories, like people, adapt to attention. They grow, they harden, they become difficult to separate from the person telling them. By the late 1960s, Darren Berger's account had moved far beyond the first wet stretch of highway. There were books, articles, late-night radio appearances. The smiling man from the roadside had become Indrid Cold, one of the strangest recurring figures in American Fortean history. And yet, the deeper the story went, the more another figure became impossible to ignore. Because somewhere in the Ohio Valley, another writer was collecting reports of red-eyed creatures, strange lights, black cars, and visitors who asked too many questions. He looked at Darren Berger's smiling man and saw not just a UFO story, but part of a much larger pattern. His name was John Keel, and he believed Indrid Cold might not be an alien at all. By the time John Keel entered the story, the Ohio Valley already felt like a place where reality had become unreliable. Reports were arriving from everywhere. Strange lights over back roads, winged figures near the old TNT area outside Point Pleasant, telephone disturbances, animals behaving strangely, men in dark suits asking questions no one had invited them to ask. The atmosphere itself seemed to thicken, as though once one impossible thing was allowed into the room, others found the door easier to open. Most people looking at these reports tried to separate them. A UFO over here, a monster over there, a nervous town turning rumor into folklore somewhere in between. Keel did the opposite. He believed they were connected. That instinct is one reason his name still hangs over every serious conversation about Point Pleasant. He was not interested in collecting strange stories like stamps. He wanted a theory large enough to hold all of them at once. And Woodrow Derenberger's smiling visitor fit perfectly. Keel was already known for chasing UFO reports and strange encounters across the country, but West Virginia became something different for him. It was not just another investigation. It felt like a concentration point, a place where the usual rules had weakened. The first Mothman reports had begun near Point Pleasant in November of 1966, only days after Derenberger's roadside encounter. Two young couples described a large winged creature with glowing red eyes near the abandoned TNT plant, and local reporter Mary Heyer began documenting the flood of strange reports that followed. That flood mattered, because once the newspapers start printing the strange starts multiplying. People came looking for monsters. Sometimes they found them. Sometimes they found only the idea of them. And somewhere inside that growing storm of fear and fascination, Keel saw a pattern. He did not believe these were simple extraterrestrials arriving in nuts and bolts spacecraft from another planet. In fact, he thought the alien explanation was often too simple, too clean, too comforting. Aliens at least obey a familiar logic. They come from somewhere, they travel here, they leave. Keel suspected something worse. He proposed the idea of what he called ultra-terrestrials. Not visitors from another planet, but intelligences that had always existed alongside us, operating just outside ordinary perception, stepping in and out of our reality when it suited them. Not extraterrestrial, extra-dimensional perhaps, or older than that. Something native to the edges of human experience. In Keel's view, these beings were not presenting themselves honestly. They were adapting, changing shape, wearing whatever mask the moment required. In another century, they might have been called fairies, demons, angels, spirits in the woods. In modern America, they arrived as UFO occupants, men in black, smiling strangers by the roadside, and winged things standing under abandoned floodlights. Different costumes, same performance. This is where Indrid Cold becomes far more interesting than a simple alien visitor, because if Keel was right, Cold was not a man from Lanulos. He was theater, a role being played, A face chosen because it would be just believable enough to stay with you. Think about that fixed smile. Think about the oddly formal clothing, the strange but polite conversation, the almost human quality of it all. Not monstrous, worse than monstrous, familiar but not quite correct. Like something had studied humanity from a distance and built a convincing imitation with one or two details left slightly wrong. That is often how old folklore describes trickster entities. They are not terrifying because they look inhuman. They are terrifying because they look almost human, close enough to let you stand there talking to them. Keel believed the Men in Black stories belonged to the same category. Strange visitors arriving after sightings, dark cars, awkward conversations, questions that felt rehearsed. People who looked human but seemed to misunderstand ordinary behavior in small, unsettling ways. Too formal, too stiff, too interested in details that should not matter. Again, not monsters, masks. And if that idea sounds absurd, it is worth remembering how often folklore repeats itself under new names. Medieval Europe told stories of travelers meeting strange figures on roads at night, beings who asked questions, offered warnings, or left people changed forever. Appalachian folklore is full of stories about things in the woods that should not be followed and visitors who should not be invited inside. Technology changes. The shape of fear does not. This is why Keel matters so much to the Indrid Cold story. Without him, Derenberger might have remained a regional UFO witness, a local mystery with a strange newspaper archive. Keel placed him inside a much larger mythological machine. He made Cold part of the same weather system as Mothman, the Men in Black, and the growing sense that Point Pleasant was not being visited by aliens, but haunted by intelligence itself. That interpretation is powerful because it solves one problem while creating 10 more. It explains why the stories contradict each other. It explains why the visitors behave like symbols instead of explorers. It explains why the details feel dreamlike, inconsistent, emotionally true, but scientifically slippery. But it also asks the listener to accept something far stranger than aliens. Not travelers from another planets, neighbors, things that have always been here, watching, adapting, waiting for us to notice. For Keel, the real mystery was never whether a ship landed on a highway. It was why these encounters always seemed designed to destabilize the witness rather than inform them. The purpose did not appear to be contact. It appeared to be confusion. The event itself mattered less than the ripple it created afterward. Fear, obsession, belief, stories spreading through a town like weather. Maybe that was the point. And if so, then Lanulos itself might not be a destination at all. It might be bait, a perfect world offered to a witness because it would hold his attention, because paradise is easier to follow than terror, because a smiling messenger is more persuasive than a monster with red eyes. That possibility makes the story darker, because it means the visitor on Interstate 77 was never introducing himself. He was designing an experience, and if that sounds like paranoia, it should, because eventually every story like this reaches the same uncomfortable place. You stop asking what happened and start asking whether the mystery wanted to happen. But even the most elegant theory meets resistance, and eventually every mythology runs into the same problem: evidence. Every good mystery eventually reaches the same uncomfortable room, the room with fluorescent lights, the room where someone asks for dates, documents, contradictions, and proof. It is easy to keep a strange story alive in the dark, where atmosphere does half the work for you. It is harder under daylight, where details have to survive being written down. Names matter there. Timelines matter. Memory becomes less poetic and more fragile. This is where the Lanulos story becomes most human. Because skepticism does not arrive as a villain, it arrives as a necessary question: what can actually be proven? To be fair to Woodrow Derenberger, the simplest skeptical explanation was never especially strong. He was not immediately dismissed as unstable or obviously fraudulent. Medical evaluations reportedly found no signs of major neurological damage, no evidence of a convulsive disorder, no obvious collapse into psychosis. Investigators did not uncover some easy scandal waiting to be exposed. He was not caught with fake photographs in the garage or wires hanging from a model spaceship. That matters. It means the case cannot be waved away with lazy certainty. There was no clean ending where everyone nodded and agreed the whole thing had been solved. Instead, there was something much more frustrating: uncertainty. And uncertainty is where folklore thrives. The strongest skeptical argument was never that Derenberger was insane. It was that the story changed. Compare the earliest roadside encounter to the later Lanulos mythology, and the difference is impossible to ignore. In the first version, the details are restrained: a strange object, a smiling man, telepathic speech, a visitor calling himself a searcher. Odd, yes, but still compact enough to feel like testimony. Then the years pass. Suddenly there is a wife named Kimmy, children, Carl Ardo, government councils, religion, 3 seasons, lifespans over a century, trade possibilities with Earth, visits to Arkansas, backyard meetings, physical trips to another world. The story does not simply continue, it expands. That pattern is familiar to anyone who studies contactee history. The first report is usually the strongest because it arrives closest to the event before public attention reshapes memory. Later versions often become larger, smoother, and more mythologically satisfying. Rough edges disappear. New details arrive exactly where listeners most want them. That does not prove deliberate deception. Memory itself is a storyteller. People reconstruct experience constantly, especially when the experience is emotionally overwhelming and repeated to strangers for years. Every retelling creates structure. Every interview asks the witness to make chaos sound coherent. Eventually, even honest memory can begin to feel like performance. And then there was Tom Monteleone. For a time, his story became one of the strongest supposed confirmations of Lanulos. Another witness, another brush with the same impossible world. For believers, it was the kind of corroboration they wanted desperately, proof that Derenberger had not built the entire thing alone. There was only one problem. Monteleone later admitted it was fiction, a story invented. That confession matters, not because it destroys the entire case, but because it reveals how badly people wanted supporting evidence and how quickly the myth absorbed anything that looked like confirmation. Once a mystery becomes famous enough, it starts attracting stories the way old houses attract ivy. Some are true, some are decoration. Eventually they become difficult to separate. Gray Barker complicates things even further. Barker was one of the great strange figures of American UFO culture, a man who understood better than most that mystery sells. He moved through the same world as Keel, men in black stories, flying saucers, and Fortean folklore, and skeptics have long argued that he blurred the line between investigation and performance so thoroughly that even he may not have known where one ended. That matters because stories do not grow in isolation. They grow inside ecosystems. Researchers, writers, believers, late-night radio hosts, newspaper editors, local eccentrics, all feeding the same machine. Some want truth, some want wonder, some want books to sell. Usually everyone gets a little of what they came for. John C. Sherwood's work on Barker is valuable because it forces the uncomfortable possibility that at least part of the Mothman and Men in Black world was shaped not only by witnesses but by people who understood the commercial value of keeping the mystery alive. That does not erase genuine experiences, but it does remind us that folklore and entrepreneurship have always been close friends. And then there is the simplest explanation of all: social contagion. A strange event is reported, local newspapers print it, television repeats it, people talk, curiosity seekers arrive, fear spreads, every odd light in the sky becomes connected, every shadow at the edge of the road acquires significance. A nervous town becomes a storytelling machine. Point Pleasant and Parkersburg were perfect environments for that kind of amplification, small enough for stories to travel fast, isolated enough for mystery to feel local and personal. By the late 1960s, the region was not just experiencing strange reports, it was expecting them. Expectation changes perception. It always has. That does not mean everyone was lying. It means belief is social. We do not experience mystery alone. We experience it inside communities, inside rumor, inside the powerful human instinct to find meaning together. And still, for all the skepticism, something remains stubborn. The first report, that lonely road, that first frightened description before Lanulos became a destination and Indrid Cold became folklore. Even skeptics tend to return there because it feels different, smaller, harder, less polished, the kernel inside the myth. Maybe Derenberger saw something he could never explain. Maybe everything after that was humanity doing what humanity does best: building cathedrals around unanswered questions. That possibility may be less satisfying than proof of aliens or proof of fraud, but it is probably closer to the truth, because most enduring mysteries are built that way. This is the part of the story that matters most, not whether Indrid Cold existed, not whether Woodrow Derenberger truly stepped onto another world, not whether a dark object really blocked Interstate 77 on a rainy November night in 1966. Those are the questions that pull people in, but they are rarely the reason stories survive. The reason stories survive is need, because people do not keep retelling mysteries for 50 years simply because they are strange. They keep retelling them because the mystery is doing something for them. It explains a fear. It protects a hope. It gives shape to something life otherwise leaves unresolved. Lanulos survives because it offers something larger than evidence. It offers relief. Look at what the story promises: a world without hatred, a world without war, a world where people live longer, understand more, and somehow escaped the machinery of violence that seems to follow humanity everywhere it goes. It is not just an alien civilization. It is a correction, a version of existence where the problems we keep calling inevitable have already been solved. That is not really science fiction. That is theology wearing a space-age coat. Every era builds its paradise out of the materials it has nearby. Medieval Europe imagined shining kingdoms beyond the sea. Religious traditions imagined heaven above the clouds. Hidden Valley myths gave us Shangri-La. Lost continent stories gave us Atlantis. Cold War America had rockets, so paradise moved to the stars. Or perhaps, if John Keel was right, just next door. That is why Indrid Cold is such a powerful figure. He is not terrifying because he threatens destruction. He is unsettling because he arrives as a witness to our failure. He stands there smiling, calm and almost kind, like someone looking at a civilization that has made all the wrong choices and still somehow expects sympathy. Mothman is fear. Indrid Cold is judgment, and judgment lingers longer. The smiling man does not need claws or red eyes. He asks ordinary questions in an ordinary voice, and somehow that feels worse. What are those lights? What is that city called? What kind of work do you do? Simple questions, but beneath them sits a deeper one. Why have you built your world this way? That may be why the story continues to attract people who are not even especially interested in UFOs. Lanulos is not compelling because it sounds scientifically plausible. It is compelling because it feels emotionally familiar. It sounds like the place people imagine when they are tired of the world they have. A better version, a cleaner version, a place where suffering was not accepted as normal. That desire is universal, and it makes the story strangely durable. Even the skeptics participate in it. They may reject the spaceship, reject the visitor, reject the details, but they still return to the emotional center of the case. Why did this particular myth take hold? Why this smiling man? Why this peaceful world? Why here? And why then? Because 1966 was not a calm year. America was watching war unfold on television. Trust in institutions was fraying. The future felt both exciting and dangerous. Space travel had made the impossible feel technically reachable, while nuclear anxiety made destruction feel just as close. It was an age where the sky looked like both salvation and threat. In that atmosphere, Lanulos made perfect sense. It was not just fantasy, it was a response, a story built to answer a moment. And perhaps that is true of all folklore worth remembering. It tells us less about what happened and more about what people were trying to survive. This is why the Silver Bridge collapse became tied to Mothman, even though the official cause was engineering failure and not prophecy. People do not want catastrophe to be random. They want warning. They want signs. They want the world to be legible, even when it is cruel. The same instinct lives inside Lanulos. People do not want suffering to be permanent. They want proof that somewhere, somehow, someone figured it out. And maybe that is the real reason the story never quite dies. Because every generation rediscovers the same quiet suspicion that the world we built cannot be the best we can do. Somewhere, the story whispers, there is another way. Maybe it is a hidden valley. Maybe it is another planet. Maybe it is just the version of ourselves we have not managed to become yet. Lanulos may not exist as geography, but as mythology, it is very real. It exists in the same place all perfect worlds exist, somewhere between memory and longing. And perhaps that is why the final image of Indrid Cold remains so strangely powerful. Not a monster chasing people through the woods, not a great machine descending from the sky, just a man standing quietly on the side of the road, smiling like he knows something we do not. Smiling like he has already seen the place we spend our whole lives trying to imagine. And perhaps he has. Or perhaps the smile only reflects our own desire looking back at us. Either way, the highway is still there. Interstate 77 still cuts through those same hills. The rain still falls. The bridges still glow at night above the river. People still drive home alone with the radio low and the road stretching farther than expected. And somewhere in the dark, every driver carries the same private thought. What if the world is stranger than it looks? That question is older than flying saucers, older than folklore, older than roads. And it is probably the reason we are all here, listening together now, not because we expect answers, but because some mysteries feel better when shared. And so the story remains, not solved, not settled, just waiting, the way certain stories always seem to wait, somewhere between history and folklore, between witness testimony and the quiet machinery of myth. The road where Woodrow Derenberger stopped his truck still exists. Interstate 77 still runs through those West Virginia hills. cutting through darkness the same way it did in November of 1966. People still drive that stretch at night. The rain still gathers on the windshield. The hills still rise black against the sky. Parkersburg still glows in the distance like a handful of lights trying to hold back a much larger dark. Most of them are probably thinking about groceries, work tomorrow, bills, whether they remembered to lock the back door. That is how these stories always begin, not with people searching for mystery, but with ordinary people trying to get home. That may be the reason this one endures, because at its center, beneath all the names and mythology and impossible geography, it is still the story of one man on one road having one moment that refused to fit inside the life he had built. Everything after that, Anomalous, Indrid Cold, the visitors, the books, the theories, may be expansion, interpretation, folklore gathering around a single hard center. Or maybe not. Maybe he really did meet someone standing at the edge of our understanding. Maybe there are places we do not know how to describe, civilizations that look at us the way we look at our own unfinished past, and maybe somewhere beyond the noise of our ordinary lives there is, in fact, a place where people learned how to stop hurting each other. I suspect that possibility is why the story still matters, not because it proves anything, because it comforts something. It suggests that our failures are not permanent, that history is not the only way a civilization can turn out, that somewhere, whether in the stars or only in the imagination, another version of life is possible. That is a powerful thing to offer people, especially at night, especially in uncertain times, especially when the world feels loud and unfinished. Maybe Anomalous is not a place. Maybe it is a question. What would a better world actually require of us? And are we willing to become the kind of people who could live there? Those are not UFO questions. Those are human ones. And perhaps that is why Indrid Cold still stands there in memory, not as a monster, not even really as an alien, but as a mirror. Calm, smiling, patient, asking ordinary questions that somehow feel larger than they should. What are those lights? What is that city called? What kind of work do you do? Simple things. Until you realize he may have been asking something else entirely. Who are you? What have you built? And why? That is where we leave it tonight. Somewhere on a wet Appalachian highway beneath bridge lights and river fog, with the radio low and the road still stretching ahead into darkness. Maybe there was never a world called Anomalous. Maybe there was. Either way, the mystery continues, because the best mysteries do not end when the story is over. They follow you home. From the quiet shores of the people of the water, where the mountains keep watch and the rivers remember everything, this has been the High Strangeness Sleep Society. Along the quiet shores and deep forests of the Pacific Northwest, welcome back to High Strangeness Sleep Society. Tonight, we travel east, beyond the evergreen coastlines and mountain range, toward another river town that once found itself sitting beside a story nobody could fully explain. A place where bridge lights reflected across black winter water, where late-night radios drifted through diners and parked cars, where old wartime roads disappeared into fog beyond the edge of town, and where, during the closing months of 1966, ordinary people began describing something waiting out there in the dark near the old TNT grounds outside Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Point Pleasant sits at a place where two rivers come together. The Ohio bends west toward Cincinnati, broad and slow, the color of cold tea most of the year. The Kanawha runs in from the east, narrower, carrying the runoff of the coal fields and the chemical valley above Charleston. They meet at a low point of land that has been called Pleasant by travelers for almost 250 years, and a town has grown there and shrunk there and settled into the slow rhythm of a river town that the highways had mostly passed by. By the autumn of 1966, Point Pleasant had about 6,000 people. The downtown was 4 or 5 blocks of brick storefronts along Main and 6th and V end. A courthouse stood at one end and the river at the other. The town had a hospital, a rail yard, a small shipyard that built barges for the river trade, and a sheriff's office where Deputy Millard Halstead worked the night shifts that nobody else wanted. The low hotel on Main Street still kept rooms for traveling salesmen who came up from Huntington. The working people of the town went to the shipyard, or to the schools, or across the bridge into Ohio, where the chemical plants needed shift labor. The town had its own gentle melancholy that fall. The big DuPont plant up at Bell had been laying off. The river trade was slowing. The schools were full, but young people were already starting to talk about leaving Columbus or Charleston or somewhere out of state where the wages were a little better and the air was a little less metallic. Point Pleasant also had a peculiar geography of its own. North of the town, just past the city limits, the highway forked, and one of those forks ran out into a flat, second-growth forest that locals called the TNT Area. It was about 3,000 acres of ground that had been a federal munitions plant during the Second World War and then mostly abandoned. The roads through it were paved but fading. The buildings, where they still stood, were concrete and grass overgrown. Ponds in there sat undisturbed since nobody fished them. Low, half-buried domes called igloos were scattered through the woods like sleeping animals. Teenagers went out there to drink, hunters for deer and rabbit, and wildlife people because the abandoned plant had become, somewhat by accident, one of the better waterfowl areas in that part of the state. The TNT was strange land, but it was used land. People knew the way through it. They had stories about it. They told the stories the way people in small towns tell stories about old asylums and closed mines and any large piece of ground that has done one thing for a while and then stopped. In the first weeks of November 1966, that piece of ground became the center of a story that nobody in Point Pleasant had asked for, and nobody in Point Pleasant has ever fully shaken off. It begins in some ways before any of the witnesses arrive, with the place itself. In 1942, the Army went looking for somewhere inland and quiet to make TNT, flat ground, plenty of water, far enough from any city that, if the worst happened, the worst would stay where it was. They settled on a stretch of bottomland north of Point Pleasant between the Ohio and the foothills. About 100 families lived there at the time, some since before the Civil War. The Army bought them out, and within a year the bulldozers had turned the corn and the pasture into a city of low concrete buildings, asphalt roads, blast walls, and storage igloos. The plant ran day and night for the duration of the war. Most of the workers were women. They came off shift with their hair and skin yellowed from contact with the chemical, and they were given the local nickname of Canary Girls. Some of them lived long lives afterward, and some of them did not. When the war ended, the plant did not need to make TNT anymore. It shut down in stages. The federal government deeded large sections of the land over to the state for wildlife management, and other sections sat. The roads stayed passable. The igloos stayed half-buried under their grass berms, looking like burial mounds in a young forest, and slowly that forest grew in around them. By 1966, the area was 20 years past the war. The igloos were partly flooded inside. Some had been used for storing seed potatoes by local farmers in the 1950s. Some had become casual hunting blinds. The North Power Plant, a large, reinforced building that had supplied electricity to the manufacturing complex during the war, still stood near the center of the area, gutted, windowless, with its long generator hall open to the weather. Local kids called it the boiler plant. Hunters used it as a landmark. It was the sort of structure that looked from a distance, and especially in low light, like something that should not still be there. The roads through the TNT had names, but most people used directions. You went out from town along Route 62, took the right at the fork, and you were in. There were wire fences in places, sagging or knocked down. There were ponds where mallards came down in the fall, and stands of young oak and hickory and the kind of brushy second growth that comes up on disturbed ground. After dark, the area was almost entirely without light. The town glow stopped a couple of miles south. The river was off to the west. To the east, there were a few farmhouses and then the dark shoulder of the hills. If you stood in the middle of the TNT area at midnight in November, with your headlights off, you could see stars in a way that you could not see them in the town below, and you could hear the river only when the wind came right. This was the country. This was where 4 young people, in 2 couples, drove out a little after 11 o'clock on the night of November 15, 1966. Before that night, there had been other reports, smaller ones, quieter ones, reports that at the time did not seem to belong to any larger pattern. The first sighting that ever made its way into print came on the evening of November 12th. 3 days before the night that everyone would remember, 5 men were digging a grave in a small cemetery near Clendenin, about an hour and a half east of Point Pleasant. They were working late. The grave was for a funeral the next morning, and they wanted to be done before the cold set in. The light was failing. November evenings in the Kanawha Valley have a particular quality, a slow draining of color that begins around 4 o'clock, and by 5 the trees have already lost their detail, and the sky is the color of slate. The men later told a reporter that something passed over them, something the size of a man, brown, gliding low through the trees. Not a bird, they said, although they reached for the word bird and could not find another one. None of them said the thing was frightening. They said it was wrong. They watched it pass between the trees, and then they finished the grave, in the dark, and they went home. One of them mentioned it the next day at the gas station. In a small West Virginia town in 1966, that was usually enough. 2 days later, on the afternoon of November 14th, in the small town of Salem in Harrison County, a couple of hours north, a building contractor named Newell Partridge was sitting in his living room watching television. Partridge was a working man with a German shepherd named Bandit. He had no particular interest in strange things, and he was not the kind of person who had ever expected to be quoted in a newspaper. The television, he later said, was working fine until it suddenly started to make a sound he had never heard from a television before. A high mechanical whine like a small generator, and the picture went to static. At about the same moment, his dog began to behave strangely. Bandit went to the door, growling, and looked out into the yard, and Partridge went to the porch and shined his flashlight out toward the hay barn. The flashlight, Partridge said, picked up two red eyes, round, reflective, and set wider apart than any eyes ought to be. He was a hunter. He had looked into the eyes of every animal that lived in those woods, and these were not any of them. The dog ran off across the yard toward whatever it was and disappeared into the dark. Partridge called for it. The dog did not come back. He stood on the porch for a long time, calling, and then he stopped calling and just stood there listening. He went back inside, locked the door, and slept that night with a rifle next to the bed. He never saw the dog again. The disappearance of Newell Partridge's German Shepherd would, in the weeks that followed, become a small and mournful side note in the larger story. Partridge himself didn't speak about it much. He told the reporter when she finally interviewed him, in the tone that older West Virginians often use when describing something they have decided not to argue about. What he had seen, and what he had lost, he had lost. And that was the end of it for him. These reports never met. The gravediggers in Clendenin had not heard of Newell Partridge, and Partridge had never been to Point Pleasant. The men in Salem and the men in Clendenin had nothing in common except a stretch of West Virginia geography and a 48-hour window in mid-November. Whatever was happening, if anything was happening at all, was moving across the landscape the way weather moves, in scattered and apparently unrelated incidents, none of which yet had a name. It would have a name within a week. By the night of November 15th, a Tuesday, Point Pleasant had been settling into its usual cold weather rhythm. The shipyard had its evening shift. The high school football season was just over. The town was at the soft edge of the holiday season, with Thanksgiving a week and a half away. Roger Scarberry and his wife Linda were both 18. They had been married for several months. Their friends, Steve and Mary Millette, also a young married couple, came over that evening, and at around 11:30 the four of them got into Roger's 1957 Chevy and went looking for somewhere to drive. There was no plan. Linda would say years later that they were just bored. They drove out of town north on Route 62, and at the fork they took the right, and they were in the TNT. The reason teenagers drove out to the TNT at night was that the TNT was the only place near Point Pleasant where you could be totally alone. There were no houses, no streetlights, and the roads were straight enough that you could open up the engine if you wanted to. On a Tuesday night in November, deep in hunting season, the area would have been almost empty. They would have had it more or less to themselves. Roger drove. The car came up the long road toward the old North Power Plant. Linda was in the back seat with Mary. As the car came near the old generator building, the headlights swept across two large red eyes set in something that was standing on the ground beside the road. The eyes did not move. The body around the eyes was tall, gray, and somehow indefinite at its edges. It was about as tall as a man, or a little taller. The eyes were the same color as bicycle reflectors, only larger. Then the thing moved. It went up the side of the power plant building and into the dark. Roger Scarberry put the car in reverse, got it back onto the main road, and floored it back toward Route 62. They were doing somewhere near 100 miles an hour. Linda would say later that the speedometer was buried, that Roger was a careful driver, and she had never seen him drive like that before or since. As they went, they said, the thing followed. It came along above the car, paralleling the road, gliding. They could see it through the windows. It was, all four of them said in the days that followed, going as fast as the car was going, faster sometimes. Once or twice it appeared to be just above the roof, although none of them turned and looked directly. The wings, when they appeared, were huge and gray and made a sound like a fan, or like an electric motor, or like something that was harder to describe than either. They came back into Point Pleasant and drove straight to the Mason County Courthouse on 6th Street, where Deputy Millard Halstead was working behind the desk. Halstead, by all accounts, was a deeply unromantic man, not the kind of man who got rattled. He told the four of them to sit down, and he listened, and he did not laugh, and he did not turn them away because he had known Roger Scarberry's family for years, and he could see the look on Linda's face. He got into his cruiser and he drove out to the TNT himself, with the four young witnesses behind him. What he saw or did not see when he got out there depends on which interview you read. When Deputy Halstead drove out toward the North Power Plant that night, he had his window down. The night was cold. He told a reporter later that the radio is what he wanted to talk about. As he came up the road toward the old plant, the police band squelch dropped out and was replaced by a steady whining sound, almost the sound of a small generator. It was loud enough that he turned the volume down, and then turned the radio off, and then drove the rest of the way in silence. He did not see the creature, although he looked. He shined his spotlight up along the side of the power plant building and across the open ground and drove a slow loop of the access road. The Scarberry's Chevy was behind him for some of this, with the four young people sitting inside, but at a certain point, Halstead waved them off and they went back to town. He did the loop alone. He found nothing, no track, no movement, no sound except for the river in the distance and the wind in the dry grass. He stayed out there for nearly an hour. When he came back to the courthouse, he sat down at his desk and wrote up the report in the careful, plain language that small-town deputies use when they are not sure what they have. He noted that the four witnesses had been sober and appeared genuinely frightened. He did not, in the report, take any position on what they had seen. Halstead would talk about that night for the rest of his life when people asked him, and the part of the story he kept coming back to was the radio. He said that he had never, before or after, heard anything like that whining sound on a police radio, and he said that he had asked the technical people when the technical people came down later, and they had told him that police radios did not generally do that. He said this without any drama, the way a man describes a small, irritating mystery that has stayed with him for 40 years. By midnight on November 15th, the story was already moving out of the Scarberry's hands. The state police came down from Charleston. The deputy from Gallia County came over the bridge from Ohio. There was a phone call to a reporter in Point Pleasant who was just sitting down to a late supper, and that phone call would change a number of things. The reporter was a woman named Mary Heyer. Mary Heyer had been in Point Pleasant a long time before any of this started. By the night the Scarberrys drove into the courthouse, she had been writing about the town for the better part of 2 decades. She was a stringer for the Athens Messenger, the daily paper out of Athens, Ohio, just up the river. She had grown up in the area. She had married a man named Joe Heyer, a printer at a small paper, and she had taken up newspaper work alongside him, in the unofficial way that wives sometimes did in small towns in those years. When Joe died in 1958, Mary kept working, because there was nothing else to do, and because the work suited her. She was, by every account, an unhurried interviewer. She was a heavy smoker. She drank coffee constantly. She wrote in longhand on legal pads and typed up her stories on an old royal in the back office of the Messenger's Point Pleasant Bureau, which was a single room above a pharmacy on Main Street. She knew everyone in town. Everyone in town knew her. She got the call from a friend at the sheriff's office a little after 1 in the morning on the night of November 15th. She put on a coat and walked the 4 blocks down to 6th Street and started taking notes. The story she filed for the next day was the first newspaper account that named what had happened. She did not call the creature anything yet. She used the word bird. She used the phrase winged man. She quoted the 4 witnesses. She quoted Deputy Halstead in his careful language. In the months that followed, Mary Hyre would become something more than a local reporter. People who had seen something, and there began to be more people, and they began to see things, and not all of them wanted to be public about it, knew that they could go to Mary Hyre and that Mary Hyre would listen carefully and would not laugh and would not spread the story until she had heard it 3 or 4 times. She kept a careful filing system. She wrote follow-up stories. She wrote down what people said, plainly, with no taste for sensationalism, and gave them their full names and their addresses and their occupations and their ages, and made it clear, in the calm sentences that she had spent 2 decades learning to write, that these were not strange people. These were ordinary people. These were factory workers and farmers and a dental hygienist and a Methodist minister and the owner of a small grocery and several teenagers who were old enough to drink coffee at the lunch counter on Main Street but not yet old enough to vote. She wrote about the Walmsleys who lived on the edge of the TNT area, who heard something on their porch the very next night and saw, briefly, a tall, dark shape with red eyes that backed away into the trees. She covered Tom Urey, a salesman driving Route 7 on a clear November morning, who said something paced his car for 2 or 3 miles before veering off into the woods. Then there was Connie Carpenter. Connie was driving home from church on a Sunday morning at the end of November when she saw, in the rearview mirror, a large figure rising out of a field behind her car. She was a young woman, recently married, on a road she had driven 100 times. She did not know what to do. She kept driving until the figure was no longer visible in the mirror, and then she pulled over a few miles down the road and was sick at the side of the highway. By the time Mary Hyre interviewed her several days later, Connie had stopped sleeping well. She told Mary Hyre that the eyes had been the worst part, that the rest of the body was hard to remember, and that the eyes followed her for some time afterward, in the sense that she would close her own eyes at night and see them again. By December, Mary Hyre's filing cabinet had a folder on it labeled simply "The Bird." The folder was full of notes. It would eventually be full of letters. Some of the letters were from cranks. Some were from people who had seen something themselves and had never told anyone. She answered all of them. She wrote the answers out in her careful hand, in pen, on the back of newspaper proofs late at night, in the apartment where she lived alone with her cats. She kept writing about it for the rest of her life. She died in 1970 in her own apartment at the age of 54. She was buried in a quiet ceremony at a cemetery on the Ohio side of the river. Her notes and her columns survive in the Athens Messenger archives. By the end of November, the story had moved beyond a single sighting at a single power plant. It had become, in the way of these things, a pattern, or what at least looked like one. There were sightings reported almost every week. Some were probably real, in the sense that the witnesses really saw something they could not identify. Some were almost certainly mistakes. Large owls, sandhill cranes blown off course in the November migration, the way that a person's eyes can play tricks in the dim ground glow of a cloudy West Virginia evening. Others, undoubtedly, were people who wanted to be part of the story. Mary Hyre, in her notes, made the distinction between what she called the careful ones and the eager ones, and she kept the eager ones in a separate folder. The careful ones were the ones whose accounts kept coming back to roughly the same details: the size, like a man, or a little larger; the wings, gray and folded against the back when the figure was standing; The eyes, red, round, set wider apart than human eyes. The sound of the wings when the figure flew, like a fan, like a small motor, like something mechanical. None of the careful witnesses described a face or a beak or a voice. There was a sense in the careful accounts that the witness was trying very hard to be honest about what they had not seen, as well as what they had. Linda Scarberry, in interview after interview over the course of decades, would always emphasize the things she could not be sure of. She would not say whether the thing had hands, or what color the body was, or whether it had hair or feathers. She had seen the eyes and the wings and the size of it. The rest, she said, she did not feel right describing. The witnesses did not embellish or dramatize. Most of them, when interviewed years later, told essentially the same story, in essentially the same words, with the same admissions of uncertainty about the same details. People inventing experiences tend to have those experiences grow over time. The Point Pleasant witnesses, almost without exception, told smaller and quieter stories the longer they had to think about them. The town itself, that month, took on a strange double life. Daytime Point Pleasant was very much itself. People went to work, the shipyard ran, the schools were open. The Low Hotel filled up, mostly with reporters now, and the lunch counters at the diners on Main Street did good business with people in unfamiliar coats holding spiral notebooks. By night, though, the TNT area filled up too, with curiosity seekers, with hunters who claimed to be looking for deer but were not, with high school boys driving out in their fathers' trucks with shotguns rattling in the beds and bottles on the seat next to them. By the second week of December, the sheriff was on local radio asking that no one go out to the TNT after dark unless they had business there. There were also, that month, things that probably had nothing to do with anything, but which made the air in town feel more crowded than usual. A series of phone calls came to homes around town that consisted of clicks and whining sounds, and then silence. Some of the calls came at 3 or 4 in the morning. Mary Heyer received several of them. So did Linda Scarberry. So did Newell Partridge, although by then he was past being surprised by anything. The phone company was called, and the phone company said it was probably a problem with a switch somewhere upriver and that it would be looked into. And after a while, the calls stopped. There was a power outage in the western part of town one night in early December that lasted about 40 minutes and that the utility could not entirely account for. There was a report of livestock disturbed on a farm near Henderson, with 1 cow injured and 3 others wandering the fields at dawn. By mid-December, the sightings had begun to taper. The weather had gone cold and gray. Snow was falling in the upper Kanawha Valley. People who had thought they might go out to look for the creature decided mostly to stay home. A young man with a notebook had arrived in town from New York. His name was John Keel. He was 36 years old, a writer of some experience, and he had heard about the Point Pleasant sightings through the wire service stories that had been picked up from Mary Heyer's reporting. He had a contract with a magazine, or said he did, and he checked into the Low Hotel and asked at the desk where he could find the reporter who had been writing about the bird. They sent him to Mary Heyer. Mary Heyer, after some consideration, agreed to talk to him. They began to walk the same ground. The winter of 1966 to 1967 was a heavy one in the Ohio Valley. The river froze in patches. The hills turned white in early December and stayed white until late February. Point Pleasant settled into the kind of hibernation that small American river towns settle into in the long, cold months. The storefronts lit early and dark by 6, the steam rising from the chemical plants across the river in the morning, the salt trucks running on Route 62 before dawn. The sightings became fewer in those months, a handful in January, 2 or 3 in February. The pattern, if there was a pattern, was harder to make out by then. The witnesses who came forward in the colder months were often older, often quieter, often the kind of people who had been thinking about whether to say anything at all and had decided finally that they wanted to. Mary Hyre kept taking the calls. She kept writing the columns, although the columns were now smaller, on inside pages, and the editor in Athens had begun to wonder, in the polite way that editors wonder, whether the bird story had run its course. There were strangers in town now, more often than there used to be. Some were reporters, fewer than before. Some were what would later be called paranormal researchers, although that phrase did not really exist yet, and the people who came down looking for explanations called themselves writers or investigators or simply travelers. They stayed at the Low Hotel. They asked questions at the gas stations and at the post office, and the people of Point Pleasant, who had always been polite to strangers, were polite to them. If you had walked the main street of Point Pleasant on a Sunday morning in February of 1967, slush on the sidewalks, the church bells going, the smell of bacon and coffee from the diner near the hotel, you would not have seen any obvious sign of what had happened in November. The town looked like every other small West Virginia river town in a long winter. People nodded to each other, went into churches, drove home for Sunday dinner. The TNT area, 3 miles out of town, was empty and snow-covered and almost silent. But if you had stopped to talk to anyone, the man at the lunch counter, the woman selling newspapers in front of the courthouse, the teenager pumping gas on the corner, you would have heard eventually in some form the story. It would have come into the conversation indirectly. They would not have led with it. They would have told you about something else: the weather, the football scores, a relative who had moved to Columbus, and then, somewhere in the back half of the conversation, they would have mentioned that there had been some strange business out by the old plant in the fall, that nobody really knew what to make of it, that they themselves had not seen anything, but their cousin had, or their daughter, or a neighbor. Then they would change the subject, or you would. By the spring of 1967, when the river thawed and the highway crews came back out, and the dogwoods came up along the riverbanks, Point Pleasant was beginning to look forward again. The creature, whatever it had been, was no longer being seen, or was no longer being reported, which is not always the same thing. The Scarberrys had moved on with their lives. Mary Hyre was working on other stories. John Keel was back and forth from New York and was beginning to put together the long manuscript that would eventually become a book. There would, of course, be more to come. The bridge that connected Point Pleasant to Ohio, the Silver Bridge, which had been built in 1928, would, by the end of 1967, become part of a much sadder chapter, one that the town has carried for the rest of its days, and that some people there have always quietly connected to the events of the previous autumn, fairly or otherwise. That is a story for another night. For now, the night of November 15th, 1966, sits where it sits. A winter road, a power plant in the dark, 4 young people in a 1957 Chevy, 2 large red eyes, a drive back to town at speeds that should have killed them and didn't, a deputy at his desk listening and writing it down, a reporter in a room above a pharmacy taking calls and making coffee. To stand on the bank of the Ohio River at Point Pleasant in the present day is to stand somewhere that has been in conversation with this story for almost 6 decades. The town has become, partly by accident and partly by choice, a place that the story is now part of. There is a museum and a statue and a festival every September that brings several thousand people from out of town. It is not what Mary Hyre would have written about. It is also not unkind. It is how a small town in America metabolizes its own strangeness over the course of 2 generations. The TNT area is still there. The North Power Plant building was demolished in the late 1960s, quietly and not as a result of the story, and only the foundation now remains, mostly buried under leaf litter and second-growth forest. The roads that the 4 young people drove that night are still navigable, though some are gated now. The ponds are there. The hunters still come. On November nights, teenagers still drive the back roads with the radio low, the way they have always done. If you go out there at dusk in November, with the wind off the river and the dry leaves moving in the access roads and the long, flat ground stretching away under a sky the color of old metal, you can understand, without having to be told, why this is the place where the story happened. It is not a haunted place exactly. The word haunted is too small for what it is. It is a place where a great deal has gone on, and the human use of the land has left a kind of pressure on the air that is hard to describe and easy to feel. The most honest thing that can be said about Point Pleasant is also the simplest. The woods know the story. The people who grew up near the woods know it too. The river, which has been there longer than any of them, keeps moving, brown and slow and deep, the way it was moving in the autumn of 1966, when 4 young people in a Chevrolet decided to drive somewhere quiet and found instead a story that has, ever since, refused to entirely close. The witnesses are mostly gone now. Linda Scarberry died in 2011. Roger Scarberry has, in recent years, declined most interviews. Mary Hyer's grave on the Ohio side of the river has a simple stone. The town and the TNT area and the igloos remain. To be from Point Pleasant, to have grown up there, to have known the streets, is to have grown up with this story always in the corner of the eye. Not always at the front of the mind, but always present. The story is part of the geography. It is part of the inheritance. The strange thing, the thing that takes a long time to work out, is that the story is not a frightening story to most of the people who live with it. It is something quieter than that. It is more like the kind of story a family carries about a relative who went missing in another country and was never found, and whose absence is mentioned on certain holidays, but is otherwise not the center of the conversation. Linda Scarberry, late in her life, gave an interview in which she was asked whether she still thought about that night. She said yes, that she still thought about it most days, that it was the strangest thing that had ever happened to her, and the most frightening, and the truest. She did not know what she had seen, she said, and she was no longer particularly interested in finding out. She had described it as honestly as she knew how, when it had happened, and she had described it the same way for the rest of her life, and she said that, at some point, you had to let a story like that be what it was. If you listen to the river at Point Pleasant on a cold November night, the river that has been there longer than the bridge or the highway or the town or the country, you can hear, sometimes, what the river has always sounded like. A slow, dark, working sound. Water that has carried a long time, and that will carry a long time more. Out beyond the bridge, north of town, in the dark stretch of woods and old roads and half-buried domes, the TNT area continues to do what it has always done. The grass moves, and the leaves fall. The frost comes down and lifts. The deer come and go. The ponds freeze and thaw. The story rests there where it began, in the wide, quiet ground between the river and the hills. The town, which has carried it now for almost 60 years, continues, in its own slow way, to live alongside it. From the land of the people of the water, thank you for spending part of your night with High Strangeness Sleep Society. Sleep well. From the quiet shores of the wise people of the water, where the rivers keep their secrets and the mountains stand guard, this is the High Strangeness Sleep Society. Tonight we are going to travel back to a warm August night in the year 1955 to a small farmhouse on a dirt lane in western Kentucky, where 11 people once swore that the strangest thing they had ever seen came walking out of the dark. There is no need to follow every name or hold every detail. If you drift off somewhere along the way, that is exactly as it should be. The story will keep itself. It has kept itself for 70 years already. So close your eyes and let us go quietly down a country road toward a little house near a town called Kelly. There is a part of Christian County, Kentucky, where the land lies low and green and easy, folded into gentle rises that the local people barely call hills. It is tobacco country and corn country, the kind of place where the roads run straight for a while and then bend without warning around the edge of someone's field. In the daytime it is bright and ordinary. At night it goes very dark. No streetlights, no glow on the horizon, just the deep blue-black of the sky and the small, steady sounds of insects in the grass. The community is called Kelly. Not quite a town, just a scattering of houses and a church and a few crossroads, sitting a short drive north of the larger town of Hopkinsville. People who live there will tell you it is a peaceful place. Nothing much was ever supposed to happen in Kelly. In the summer of 1955, one of those scattered houses belonged to a woman named Glennie Langford. It was a simple farmhouse, wood-framed and plain, set back from the road with a well in the yard and fields all around. There was no running water, which is why the well in the yard mattered so much. The nearest neighbor was not close. Glennie Langford was the heart of that household, a quiet, deeply religious widow, soft-spoken, not given to wild talk or tall tales. The people who knew her described her as gentle and honest, the sort of person whose word carried weight precisely because she used it so carefully. Whatever else you may come to think about this story as the night unfolds, hold on to that one fact about her, because it is the thread that so many people have followed back to it again and again. The house that August was full. Glennie had her younger children with her and 2 grown sons from an earlier marriage and their wives and a brother-in-law and a pair of visitors who had come to stay for a while. By the time the sun went down on the 21st of August, there were 11 people under that roof, 8 of them adults and 3 of them children. A full house on a hot summer night, with the windows open to catch whatever breeze the dark might bring. That is the place. A plain house, a deep country dark, a family gathered together, and a well in the yard, waiting for someone to walk out to it. The 2 grown sons were named Elmer and John Charlie, though almost no one called them by those names. Elmer went by Lucky, a nickname that would take on a strange flavor before the night was through. They were working men, plain-spoken and unpolished, men who had handled firearms their whole lives and thought nothing of it. Their wives were there too, and a brother-in-law, rounding out the household adults. Among the visitors was a young couple from Pennsylvania. Billy Ray Taylor had come down with his wife to stay a while, a guest far from home, sitting in a borrowed house in an unfamiliar stretch of Kentucky on a hot night. And then there were the children. Glennie's younger ones, a boy named Lonnie, another named Charlton, and a little girl named Mary. Children who should have been drifting off to sleep in the back rooms while the grown-ups talked, the way children do on summer nights when the heat keeps everyone up a little later than usual. Supper had come and gone, and outside the light drained slowly out of the sky, from gold to rose to a deep soft gray, then nothing at all. The night sounds had taken over the fields. Somewhere in the yard a dog lay half asleep, and the air carried warm earth, cut grass, and the faint metallic coolness that rises off well water. Around 7 o'clock in the evening, Billy Ray Taylor stood up, said he was thirsty, and stepped out the back door to walk to the well for a drink of water. He walked out into the yard, into the wide Kentucky dark, and he looked up at the sky. And that is where the ordinary part of the evening ends. Billy Ray Taylor would say afterward that he had not been looking for anything. But as he stood by the well, something out toward the west caught his eye and held it. A light came across the sky, bright, brighter than a star, brighter than anything that belonged up there. As it moved, it seemed to carry color with it, a shimmer he later tried to put into words by saying it held all the colors of the rainbow. It traveled in a long arc, low and silent, then went down beyond the trees, out past the edge of the property, into a gully a good distance from the house. Unlike a falling star, it did not flash and vanish. By his account, it settled as though it had come down to rest somewhere out in the fields. He stood there a moment longer, watching the place where it had gone. Then he went back inside. You can imagine how that was received. A young man comes in from the yard and says he has just seen a glowing thing cross the sky and come down in the field. And the people in the room look at him, and someone laughs, and someone says it was a shooting star, and the talk moves on. They went back to their evening, and the matter was, for the moment, closed. A young man saw a light. The light went down in the field. Nobody believed him. The lamps stayed lit in the farmhouse, and the children settled toward sleep. Then, sometime after 8 o'clock, the dog began to bark. Out in the yard, the family dog did not bark the way it barked at a passing car or a rabbit in the grass. It set up a hard, frightened noise aimed out toward the fields, toward the dark, toward the direction of the gully where the light had gone down. Just as suddenly, the barking stopped. The dog ran in under the house and pressed itself into the crawl space and would not come out. For the rest of that long night, the animal that should have been the family's first line of warning stayed hidden beneath the floorboards and made no sound at all. A dog that barks at the dark is one thing. A dog that takes one look at the dark, falls silent, and hides is telling you something it cannot say in words. The people in the house felt the change in the air the way you feel a room go quiet behind you. Something had come up out of the fields toward the house. Now there were 2 men reaching for the guns. Lucky Sutton and Billy Ray Taylor took up firearms and went to the back door to look out into the yard. They were not frightened men by nature. They had grown up around guns, and stepping out to see what bothered the dog was the natural thing to do. They expected, at the worst, to find a stray animal, or a stranger, or nothing at all. What they saw out past the edge of the light spilling from the house was a small figure coming toward them across the yard. It was short. The family would describe it in the days that followed as somewhere between 2 and 4 feet tall, the height of a small child, though nothing else about it was childlike. It seemed to shine. Its body had a glow to it, a dull, silvery sheen, as though it were lit faintly from within, or coated in something that caught what little light there was. Its head was large and round, set with 2 great eyes that glowed yellowish in the dark, and ears that came to points. The mouth, when they could make it out, was a long, thin line stretched too far across the face. The arms ran too long, ending in clawed hands. Its legs were spindly. It did not quite walk exactly. It came forward with its arms raised over its head, hands open, in a posture that a person might read as surrender, or as a greeting, or as something with no human meaning at all. It came on across the yard, closer and closer, until it was roughly 20 feet from the two men standing in the doorway, and they fired. Both men shot at the small, glowing figure, point blank by the standards of a shotgun, close enough that they could not have missed. And the thing did not fall, and it did not bleed, and it did not die. The witnesses said the sound of the shot striking it was the strangest part. It was not the soft sound of a bullet finding flesh. It was a hard, hollow, ringing sound, like buckshot rattling off a metal bucket. The figure was knocked over backward by the force of it. It went down, flipped itself over, and then it scrambled up and away into the dark, moving fast and low, and was gone. The two men stood in the doorway with their ears ringing and the smell of gunpowder in the air, and tried to understand what they had just seen. There was no body in the yard. There was no blood. There was only the dark and the silence where the dog's barking should have been, and the slow, cold understanding that whatever they had shot had simply gotten up and left. They went back inside and shut the door. Almost at once the thing, or another exactly like it, appeared at the window. The night stopped being a single strange event and became something longer and harder to hold, because the small glowing figures did not come once and leave. They came back. They came to the windows, lifting their great eyes to the glass and peering in at the people inside. They came to the doorway. The family began to understand with a creeping dread that they were not dealing with one creature, or even two. There were several of them out there in the dark, moving around the house looking in, and the men with the guns could not make them stop. What followed lasted the better part of the night, and to the people living through it, the hours moved strangely, long in the silence, sudden in the noise. They had a way of moving that the witnesses found hard to describe in ordinary terms. The creatures did not always seem to run or walk. At times they appeared to drift, to float, to move through the trees and across the ground without the effort a body usually shows. When one of them was up in a tree and was shot, it did not crash down through the branches the way a shot animal would. It seemed to float down, slow and light, and touch the ground and right itself. There was a lightness to them, a wrongness in the way they answered to gravity, that unsettled the men more than the claws or the eyes ever could. The most frightening single moment of the night came at the doorway. Billy Ray Taylor stepped out beneath a small overhanging roof at the back of the house, and from above him, from up on that low roof, a clawed hand came down out of the dark and touched his hair. The people behind him saw it happen, saw the long, thin arm and the open claw reaching down toward the young man's head, and they cried out and seized him and hauled him back inside by main force. Lucky Sutton fired up through the overhang, up at the roof, at the shape that crouched there. Once again, the thing was knocked back and floated away and was simply gone, leaving no mark behind but the holes the shotgun had torn through the screen and the boards. Think of what that house must have felt like in those hours. 11 people, 3 of them small children, gathered in the lamplight in the middle of the deep country dark. The dog hidden silent under the floor, the windows full of glowing eyes that came and went. The men firing shot after shot into figures that would not die until the smell of powder hung thick in every room and the floor was scattered with spent shells. And the worst of it, the truly unbearable part, was that the creatures never showed the slightest sign of anger. They did not attack. They did not try to break in. They peered and they reached, and they bobbed up at the windows almost playfully. Curious, it seemed, as though the terrified family inside were the strange and interesting thing, and not the other way around. The guns, which should have meant safety, meant nothing. A rural family in 1955 could meet almost any threat the night might bring. A prowler, a wild animal, a stranger with bad intentions. For all of these, the shotgun by the door was answer enough. But you cannot frighten away a thing that does not bleed. You cannot reason with eyes that only watch. Every shot they fired came back to them as that same hollow metallic ring, and every creature they knocked down got up again, and the night went on, and the dark outside stayed full. There were the children to think of too, and that must have been its own quiet agony. 3 little ones, Lonnie and Charlton and Mary, gathered into the safest inner room while the grown-ups moved between the windows with the guns. Glennie Langford, by every account, kept her head through all of it, holding the children close, keeping them from the glass, her face steady even when there was nothing steady left inside her. The household did not come apart. They kept the small ones to the center and the danger to the edges, and they held. For something like 3 hours they endured it, shooting, retreating, listening to the soft scratching that came now and then across the roof. There was only the family and the lamplight and the things at the windows. At last, somewhere near 11 o'clock, they decided they could not stay in that house one moment longer. They were going to make a run for it. They went out fast, all of them, crowding into the cars in the yard, expecting at any second to feel a clawed hand or to see a glowing shape rise up in the headlights. They drove hard down the dark lane and toward the lights of Hopkinsville, toward the one place they could think of where someone might believe them, or at least might help. They drove to the police. The Hopkinsville police station was a calm place on a Sunday night until the Sutton family arrived. 8 adults and 3 children came through the door in a state that the officers would remember for the rest of their lives. These were not pranksters enjoying a joke. They were, by every account given that night, genuinely terrified. Grown men who worked with their hands, shaken to the core. Glennie Langford, white-faced and trembling, children clinging to the adults. Whatever had happened out at that farmhouse, the people standing in the station plainly believed every word they were saying, and their fear was the kind that cannot easily be performed. The police took it seriously. The chief himself responded. Before the night was over, the little farmhouse near Kelly would draw a remarkable gathering of officials, city police, state troopers, deputy sheriffs, and military police from the nearby Army base at Fort Campbell. It is the response of people who looked into the eyes of the family telling the story and concluded that, true or not, these people believed they were in real danger, and that a yard full of frightened men with shotguns was a real danger of its own. They drove out together in a convoy, the law and the family both, back down the dark lane to the house. The officers searched the property thoroughly by flashlight and headlight all through the rest of that night, and they found nothing. No creatures, no bodies, no blood, no tracks they could point to with certainty. The glowing little men were not there when the police arrived, and they did not come while the lawmen walked the yard. What the officers did find was the wreckage of a long night of terror. The window screens were torn and punched through. There was damage where shots had been fired. The signs of a genuine firefight were everywhere, even if the enemy in that fight had left nothing of itself behind. One investigator who came later would describe an odd, luminous patch glowing faintly along a fence, at a spot where one of the creatures was said to have been shot, and a strange green light off in the woods, whose source no one could trace. But standing in that dark field in the small hours, With the family's story still ringing in their ears, the men who saw them did not find them easy to dismiss. The police could do only so much. There were no creatures to arrest. After a couple of hours of searching and finding nothing more, the officers packed up and drove back to town, leaving the family alone in the house once more. It was somewhere around 2 in the morning. The lawmen no doubt expected that to be the end of it, a strange call on a slow night, a story to tell back at the station. But it was not the end of it, because the family had barely settled, had barely begun to believe the danger was past, when the creatures came back. Around 3:30 in the morning, the glowing figures returned to the windows. Glennie Langford herself later said that she saw one of them at her window, its great eyes looking in at her out of the dark. The second siege did not last as long as the first, but it was enough. When the sun finally came up over Christian County and the long night ended, the family did not stay to greet the day. They packed what they could and they left that house. When officers returned later to the property, they found it empty. The house stood where it had always stood, quiet in the morning, its torn screens and scattered shells the only record of what had passed there in the night. When morning came, the story did not stay quiet for long. The local newspaper, the Kentucky New Era, carried it first, and from there it spread outward across the country. People came to the farmhouse to see the place for themselves. The Air Force, which in those years ran a long-running study of such reports called Project Blue Book, took note of the case and, in the end, set it down in their files as a hoax and moved on. And so we arrive at the question that has followed this story for 70 years. What walked in that yard? Let us sit with the possibilities gently, the way you would turn a smooth stone over in your hand, without any need to decide. The most patient and careful of the doubters have offered an answer that has nothing of the spaceship in it at all. They point to the great horned owl, a bird that lives in exactly that part of Kentucky and hunts in exactly that kind of late summer dark. It flies in complete silence, which could account for the floating, drifting movement that so unsettled the witnesses. Its eyes catch lamplight and glow yellow. 2 feathered tufts rise from its head like pointed ears. It is fiercely protective of its nest, willing to dive and strike at anything that comes too near. Explanation enough for the clawed shape that reached down from the roof toward Billy Ray Taylor's hair. By this reading, a pair of angry owls, lit by lamplight and lifted into something monstrous by fear and darkness, became the little glowing men of Kelly. This case is unusual even among stories of its kind. Most such reports come down to 1 or 2 people catching something briefly at the edge of their vision, gone in an instant. This was 11 people at close range over the course of hours, all telling the same story. Every piece of that night has an ordinary shape behind it, if you tilt it just right toward the light, and every piece in the dark becomes something else entirely. That is where this story has always lived, not in the solving of it, but in the space between the lantern and the field. We do not need to decide. We only need to stand for a moment at the edge of what is known and look out. In one sense, the creatures of Kelly did leave in the gray hours before dawn and were never seen again. In another sense, they never left at all. They simply moved out of that farmyard and into the wider imagination of the country, and there they have stayed ever since. The phrase that grew up around them is one you have heard your whole life, even if you never knew where it came from. The early newspaper stories did not call the creatures green. The color was added later by writers reaching for a way to picture them and somewhere in the retelling, the little glowing men of Kelly became the little green men. From this small farmhouse in Kentucky, the phrase spread out across the world until it belonged to everyone, a kind of shorthand for visitors from the sky, repeated in 1,000 jokes and cartoons and films by people who never heard the name Hopkinsville. The fear of that one August night dissolved into the common language and lost its terror and became almost cozy. The town did not forget either. The little community of Kelly, which never asked for any of this, made a kind of quiet peace with its strange night. Each year they hold a gathering, a friendly small-town festival named for the Little Green Men, where families come out to celebrate the most famous thing that ever happened on their stretch of road. There is something gentle in that, in a place taking the most frightening night in its history and turning it with time into an occasion for neighbors to gather in the summer warmth. Fear, given enough years, can soften into wonder. The thing that sent a family fleeing into the dark becomes the thing that brings a town together in the light. We are left in the end where we so often are with these stories, standing at the edge of a dark field, looking out at a place where something may have happened that we cannot fit into the shape of the ordinary world. The evidence drove away before dawn. The witnesses are gone now. What remains is the night itself, held in the memory of a small town, and in the strange afterlife of a phrase, and in the quiet certainty of the people who were there that they had met something they could not explain. At the center of it all, if you follow the story back far enough, you come again to Glennie Langford, a woman who never wanted to be famous, who gave her account plainly and never changed it, and who carried what she saw at that window to the end of her days. She was not a person who chased the strange. The strange came up out of a Kentucky field and looked in at her through the glass, and she told the truth about it as best she could. And then she lived the rest of her life. There is a kind of dignity in that which has nothing to do with whether the creatures were owls or visitors or something with no name. She saw what she saw. She said what she saw, and she let the world make of it what it would. So that is the night the little men came to Kelly, a glowing thing in the western sky, a dog that hid beneath the floor, a family that fired into the dark for hours at figures that would not fall, and fled before dawn, and never doubted what they had seen. Out in Christian County, the fields are still there, and the dark still comes down soft and complete over the low green land on summer nights. The house is gone now, but the road remains, and the gully, and the deep country quiet where a young man once stood at a well and looked up and saw a light come down. It is enough to let it stay where it has always been, just out at the edge of the lamplight, half seen, never caught. The dog has come out from under the house. The fields are quiet. The little men, whatever they were, have gone back into the dark, where the stories live, and there they will stay. From all of us at the High Strangeness Sleep Society, sleep well.